The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day the south fence collapsed, and Wade Mercer's last good gelding threw a shoe in the frozen mud and went lame before noon. He stood in the barn doorway reading the letter a second time, not because he'd missed anything the first time, but because he kept hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less damaging. They didn't. The Billings Bank was calling in 60% of his loan by the 1st of March, which gave him 11 weeks to produce money he didn't have from a cattle operation that had been bleeding slowly since his father died 2 years ago. And Wade had inherited not just the land, but every bad decision the old man had made in the final decade of his life. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and went back to work. That was how Wade handled most things. He folded them up and put them somewhere and went back to work. The Mercer Ranch sat in a wide valley in southwestern Montana, backed against a long ridge of ponderosa pine and facing south toward a frozen creek called Harlan's Run. It was 1,800 acres at its peak, now closer to 1,400 after his father had sold off the northeast parcel to cover a gambling debt Wade hadn't known about until after the funeral. The main house was a 2-story timber frame that had never been properly winterized, and the bunkhouse where his 3 remaining hands slept was drafty enough that the men kept a fire going through the night even in October. The cattle were down to 340 head, lean from a dry summer, and they needed to come through the winter in sellable condition, or the March payment would be the first of many disasters. Wade needed help. He'd known it for 6 months and ignored it for 6 months, because asking for help was something the Mercer men did not do, a principle his father had held to with such rigid devotion that it had eventually killed him. Not dramatically, but slowly, the way stubbornness usually kills a man, through accumulated bad choices made alone. It was Cal Briggs, his oldest hand, who finally said it plainly. "You need a cook," Cal said one morning in early November, pushing a plate of Wade's burned biscuits to the side of the table with the resignation of a man who has accepted suffering. "Something that can actually feed us through winter. I ain't asking for fancy. I'm asking for edible." "I can cook," Wade said. "No," Cal said. "You cannot." The other 2 hands, Denny Hobart and a young man named Russ, who'd only been with them since August, said nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. Wade placed an ad in the Havre Courier and 2 smaller papers. He was specific. Experienced cook, ranch environment, must tolerate rough conditions and rougher men. He expected to hear from a handful of down-on-their-luck drifters, maybe a former soldier or a widower looking for steady work and a warm place to sleep. He did not expect Hannah Cross. She came on the stage from Miles City, arriving at the Dillon Junction stop on a gray Thursday afternoon in the second week of November, with a canvas bag over one shoulder, a crate of cooking equipment wrapped in burlap, and a small boy walking beside her with his hand tucked into hers. Wade was there to meet whoever answered the ad. He'd gotten 1 letter of response, brief and direct, stating cooking experience and availability and a rate that was lower than he'd expected. He hadn't asked follow-up questions. He'd written back with directions. He saw the woman and the child get off the stage and he stood by his wagon and waited, assuming they were meeting someone else, passing through, anything other than walking toward him with the steady, purposeful stride of a person who knows exactly where they're going. "Mr. Mercer," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," he said. "Hannah Cross." She put her hand out and he shook it. Her grip was firm and her palm was calloused, which told him something. "This is Noah." He looked down at the boy. The boy looked up at him. He was maybe 4 years old, possibly 5, with dark hair that needed cutting and a serious expression that seemed too settled for his age. He had gray eyes. Not common, not the kind of gray that was almost blue, but a true storm gray, the color of cloud cover before snow. And something about those eyes made the back of Wade's neck go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the November wind. He looked away from the boy and back at Hannah Cross. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered and solid, not in the way of someone who had let themselves go, but in the way of someone built for physical work, built to last. She had dark hair pulled back simply, and a face that was composed without being cold, the kind of face that had learned to not show too much to strangers. She was watching him with a calm, direct gaze, and he understood in that moment that she was taking his measure the same way he was taking hers. "You didn't mention a child," Wade said. "You didn't ask. I'm asking now." "He's mine," she said. He's quiet and he doesn't cause trouble. He'll need to sleep near me. He won't interfere with the work." Wade looked at the boy again. The boy had not fidgeted once during this exchange. He stood with his hand still in his mother's and watched Wade with those unsettling gray eyes and said nothing. "All right," Wade said, and picked up her crate because it looked heavy, and that was how it started. The drive back to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours over frozen, rutted road, and Wade spent most of it focused on the horses and the darkening sky to the northwest, which had the look of a system coming down from Canada. Hannah sat beside him on the wagon bench with the boy between them, and she asked reasonable questions about the ranch in a tone that suggested she was gathering information rather than making conversation. How many men? How was the kitchen set up? What did they typically eat through winter? What did he have in stores? He answered. He was not a talkative man, but he was not deliberately rude, and she wasn't chattering at him. She was asking things she needed to know. He could work with that. "Where'd you cook before?" he asked, somewhere past the halfway point. "Cattail Station, over in Custer County, Roadhouse. Before that, a mining operation up near Gilt Edge." "Long way from home," he said. "I'm from Laramie originally," she said. "Doesn't feel that far anymore." He glanced at the boy, who was looking at the landscape with that same quiet attention, and felt the strange cold thing again at the back of his neck and pushed it away. "He doesn't talk much," Wade said. "He talks when he has something to say," Hannah said. "Bitte." The ranch hands did not react well. Cal Briggs took one look at Hannah Cross climbing down from the wagon and then looked at Wade with an expression that required no translation. Denny Hobart was more direct. He waited until Hannah was inside and then said, "That's our cook?" "That's our cook," Wade said. "She brought a kid." "I noticed." "Boss, go fix the south fence," Wade said. "It's been down 3 days." Denny went. Russ, the youngest, had the good sense to carry the burlap crate inside without being asked, which was the right instinct even if he couldn't have explained why. Wade showed Hannah the kitchen himself. It was a large room that had clearly been designed with cooking in mind. The range was a good one, a majestic 6-burner that his mother had ordered from a catalog in 1881. But it had been badly maintained and showed the accumulated neglect of 2 years of men cooking for themselves, which meant burned residue on every surface and a spice cabinet that held salt, more salt, and a tin of something that had lost its label. Hannah stood in the center of the kitchen and turned slowly, taking it in. "The range still works?" she said. "It works. I'll need things from town. I'll write a list." "Keep it practical," he said. "I always do," she said, which he believed. Prosit. She made supper that first night in under an hour. Elk stew from 2 hindquarters Cal had shot and cured that autumn, with biscuits that were actually biscuits, golden brown and soft inside, and a pot of coffee so much better than what they'd been drinking that Denny Hobart drank 3 cups and then sat there looking faintly ashamed of himself. Nobody said much. The food was good enough that it didn't require comment, and the men had the particular silence of people who are slightly embarrassed by how grateful they are. Noah ate at the end of the table, methodically and without complaint, and then asked his mother in a whisper if he could be excused, and Hannah said yes, and that was it. Later, after the men had drifted back to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done, Wade was in his office working on the accounts. A nightly ritual he had come to dread the way some men dread Sunday sermons, when he heard small footsteps in the hall and looked up to find Noah standing in the doorway. The boy looked at him without expression. "You're supposed to be in bed," Wade said. "I know," Noah said, "so go to bed. Are you the man who owns this place?" "Yes." "It's a big place," Noah said. "It used to be bigger," Wade said, and didn't know why he told that to a 4-year-old. Noah considered this. "Our place in Miles City was small," he said. "It was 1 room. Is that so?" "Mama worked a lot," Noah said. It was not a complaint, just a fact stated plainly, with the economy of a child who has learned what is worth saying. "She seems like she works hard," Wade said. Noah looked at him for another moment and then said, "Good night," and left. Wade sat for a long time with his pen in his hand and didn't write anything. The first week was an adjustment. The second week was something else. Hannah Cross did not try to make herself invisible, which was what Wade had half expected. A woman in a difficult situation learning to take up as little space as possible. She was not like that. She moved through the kitchen and the main house with the efficiency of someone who had been running operations like this for years, which she had, and she did not ask permission for decisions that fell clearly within her domain. She reorganized the storeroom on the third day. On the fifth day, she renegotiated with the supply man from Dillon Junction, getting a better price on flour and salt pork, and mentioned it to Wade at supper with the same tone she'd used to report that the weather was changing. "You didn't have to do that," Wade said. "I know," she said, "but the man was charging you 20 cents over market on flour. It's not complicated." Cal Briggs, who was sitting across the table, made a sound that might have been a laugh and converted it quickly into a cough. The hands came around faster than Wade expected. Denny held out longest. Denny always held out longest. It was a point of personal pride. But by the end of the second week, he was leaving wood by the kitchen door without being asked, which was the closest thing to a white flag that Denny Hobart was capable of raising. Noah, for his part, learned the geography of the ranch with quiet diligence. He did not run or shout or demand attention. He followed at a distance, watching the men work, occasionally asking single questions that were almost always good ones. Cal took a shine to him in the way older men sometimes do with serious children. He'd explain things in detail, the names of tools, how a saddle was cinched, why you checked hooves before and after a ride. And Noah listened with the focused attention of someone taking notes. Wade watched all of this from a distance and tried to name the feeling it gave him. He couldn't, quite. It sat somewhere between comfort and dread. Mom. The problem was the eyes. He told himself it was coincidence the first time. The second time he told himself it was the light. By the end of the second week, he had stopped telling himself anything and was simply sitting with the fact of it. The boy's eyes were the same shade of gray as Wade's own, and the shape of his jaw and the way he held his shoulders had something in them that Wade recognized not from memory, but from photographs. The old photographs his mother kept on the mantle. Wade at 3 years old and 4 and 5, serious-faced and dark-haired and already carrying himself like a man who expected the world to require something of him. He did not know what to do with this. He had no framework for it. He went through what he knew. Noah was perhaps 4 years old, possibly just turned 5. Hannah had come from Laramie originally. She'd worked in Custer County and before that at Gilt Edge. If the boy was 5, he'd been conceived around 1879, and in the spring of 1879, Wade had been 23 years old and had spent 2 months on a cattle drive that had taken him through Laramie in April. He remembered Laramie. He remembered a woman, not clearly, not with the detail of someone who had taken proper notice, because he had been 23 and foolish, and not someone who paid proper attention to things that might matter later. He remembered dark hair. He remembered a boarding house. He remembered leaving. He stood at the barn one evening after supper with the cold coming down hard and the sky turning the color of iron, and he thought, that child could be mine. And then he thought, I am not going to say that to her. I am not going to say that yet. And then he thought, but I have to know. He asked her on a Saturday, which was the day he'd been building toward it all week without admitting it. She was in the kitchen making bread, and Noah was in the main room by the fire with a piece of wood Cal had given him and a small knife, attempting to whittle with more enthusiasm than skill. The house was warm and smelled of yeast and pine smoke, and Wade stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before speaking. I need to ask you something, he said. Then ask it, she said without looking up from the dough. He told her what he remembered. He laid it out simply, without embellishment. Laramie, April 1879, a boarding house. He told her he wasn't certain, that he was probably wrong, that he wasn't trying to start anything. He just needed to know. The kitchen was very quiet. Hannah's hands went still in the dough, and she kept her eyes down for a long moment. Then she straightened up and wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face him. His birthday is January 17th, she said. 1880. Wade did the arithmetic without moving. Why didn't you... He started. I didn't know your name, she said, not angry, just matter of fact. You didn't leave one. You were gone before dawn. She met his eyes steadily. I wasn't looking for you. I'm still not looking for you. I answered your advertisement because I needed work and I'm good at the work. That's all this is. But you knew, he said, when you saw the advertisement, Mercer Ranch, southwestern Montana. You knew there was a chance. Something shifted in her face. Not much, but enough. I thought there was a chance, she said carefully. I didn't know. You came anyway. Noah needed a stable situation, she said. I needed work that paid enough to save something. Those were my reasons. And if I'd been someone else? Then he'd still have needed a stable situation, she said, and I'd still need the work. He didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure there was one. I'm not trying to claim anything from you, Hannah said. I want that clear. I'm not here asking for anything beyond the arrangement we already made. Whatever you want to do with this information is your decision. He looked past her toward the main room, where Noah was bent over his piece of wood, with his tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth in concentration. He doesn't know, Wade said. He knows his father left before he was born, and that I don't know where his father is, Hannah said. That's the truth I gave him. It's more truth than most children get. Wade nodded slowly. He pushed off the doorframe and walked into the main room and stood near the fireplace and watched Noah work on his piece of wood for a while. The boy didn't look up. What are you making? Wade asked. A horse, Noah said. It doesn't look like a horse yet. It takes practice, Wade said. That's what Cal said. Cal's right. Noah held up the wood and examined it critically. I think this part might be the head, he said, pointing to a lumpy protrusion. Or the tail. I can't tell. Could be either, Wade said. I'm going to say it's the head, Noah decided, and went back to work. Wade stood there a moment longer and then went to his office and sat down and looked at the accounts without seeing them. The weather broke bad in the third week of November, a hard freeze that came down fast and settled in like it intended to stay until March. The thermometer outside the kitchen door read 8 degrees on a Tuesday morning and hadn't been above 20 in 4 days. The cattle were pushed into the lower pastures where the shelter belts offered some protection, and the men were doing 2-hour rotations through the night to check for animals that had gone down. Wade was running on 4 hours of sleep most nights. The ranch demanded that kind of attention in deep cold. There was always something that needed doing: a frozen water trough, a gate latch that had seized, a horse that had pulled up lame in the icy corral. He moved through the days on habit and coffee and the food Hannah put on the table 3 times a day without fail, which was more of an anchor than he would have admitted. One morning he came in from the pre-dawn check to find her already in the kitchen, the stove going, coffee on. She looked at his face and didn't say anything about how he looked, which he appreciated, just handed him a cup and went back to the biscuits. Cal says the northwest corner fence is down in 2 places, she said. I know. We'll get to it today. He also says there's a steer stuck in the creek bend. Wade closed his eyes briefly. Of course there is. He already went after it, she said. Took Russ. He drank his coffee and let the heat of the kitchen work on his hands, which had gone past cold to the painful rewarming stage that came with thawing out properly. The kitchen window showed the yard in the gray half-light before dawn, and he could see the ice sheeting on the fence posts and the thin smoke from the bunkhouse chimney. How's Noah in this? He asked. He wasn't entirely sure why he asked. He's fine, she said. Sleeps through cold better than I do. She glanced at him sideways. He asked about you this morning. What did he ask? He asked if you were in charge of the horses or just the cows. Wade almost smiled. What did you tell him? I told him both, she said. That's about right, he said. He finished his coffee and went back out into the cold. The threat arrived in the shape of a letter, the way the worst things often did. It came on a Friday with the supply man from Dillon Junction, tucked in with the flour and the salt pork and a bolt of wool Hannah had ordered for mending. The envelope had Hale Land and Cattle Company printed in the upper left corner in neat black type, and Wade's name on the front in handwriting that looked like it had been produced by someone paid to produce handwriting. He read it twice standing in the yard. Victor Hale was offering to buy the Mercer Ranch at a price that was, on paper, reasonable, slightly below what the land would have been worth at its peak a decade ago, which made it an insult dressed as generosity. The letter cited the difficult economic conditions facing smaller operations in the region and Hale's ongoing interest in consolidating viable grazing land in the valley. It ended with a request for a meeting at Hale's convenience. Wade folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket, the same pocket where the bank letter had been. He'd known Hale was watching. Everyone in the valley knew Hale was watching. Victor Hale had been methodically acquiring land in the Harlan's Run Valley for 3 years. buying out operations that had gone under and pressuring ones that hadn't yet. He ran 12,000 head on land that had once belonged to 6 different families, and he had the sheriff and Dillon in his pocket, or at least that was what people said, and Wade had never had reason to doubt it. He'd thought the ranch was too small to bother with. He'd been wrong. That evening, after supper, he told Cal what the letter said. Cal was quiet for a while. "You going to that meeting?" Cal asked. "No," Wade said. "You're going to tell him that." "I'm going to not respond," Wade said, which is the same thing. Cal nodded slowly. "He won't take that well." "Probably not." They sat with that for a moment. "Hannah know?" Cal asked. "Not yet." "You going to tell her?" Wade looked out the window at the dark. "She's got enough to deal with," he said, which was not an answer, and both of them knew it. The thing about a secret is that it changes the way you move through a space. You become more careful about certain rooms, certain conversations, certain directions you let your eyes travel. Wade had always been private. That was different from being secretive. But he found himself in new territory now, carrying 2 things he didn't know what to do with. The letter from Hale, which was a practical threat with practical consequences, and the fact of Noah, which was something he had no category for. He watched the boy without trying to watch him. Noah had made himself a small world in the main house, a corner near the fireplace where he kept his current project, the much-abused piece of wood that was slowly, stubbornly, beginning to resemble an animal of some kind, and a stack of magazines Cal had produced from some forgotten corner of the bunkhouse, which Noah examined with grave attention, despite being unable to read most of the words. One afternoon, Wade sat across the room and watched him trace the illustrations in an old issue of Harper's Weekly with one careful finger, and the thing he felt was not sentiment. He was not a sentimental man, but something closer to recognition, a sense that he was looking at something that was, in some fundamental way, connected to him, and that this connection was not going to go away just because he didn't know how to hold it. He thought about his own father, about the particular silence that had lived in this house throughout his childhood, the silence of a man who worked hard and loved adequately and communicated none of it. He thought about what it meant to be a boy growing up in that silence, and whether he had the capacity to be something other than that silence himself. He was 30 years old, and he had never once considered being a father, not because he'd decided against it, but because it had never been close enough to consider. Now it was sitting 6 feet away, wearing a serious expression, tracing pictures of ironclad warships with his finger. "Noah," he said. The boy looked up. "Come here," Wade said. "I want to show you something." Noah got up and came over, and Wade moved to the desk in the corner, the old one his father had used, and opened the bottom drawer where he kept a set of maps. Survey maps, property maps, the old territorial charts that showed the valley as it had been and as it was now. He spread the largest one on the desk. "This is the ranch," he said, and put his finger on the territory. Noah leaned in, looking at the map with the same focused attention he gave everything. "All of it?" he said. "Most of it," Wade said. "See this line here? That's Harlan's Run. That's the creek." "I know the creek," Noah said. "Cal showed me." "Good. And this?" He traced the boundary line. "This is where our land ends and someone else's begins." "Whose?" Wade paused. "A man named Hale," he said. "He has land on the other side." "Is he a neighbor?" "No," Wade said. "He's not." Noah looked at him, apparently waiting for more, and when more didn't come, he turned back to the map and studied it. "It's shaped kind of like a boot," Noah said. Wade looked at the map. He'd looked at that map 100 times and never noticed that. But Noah was right. The property lines, with the creek cutting in from the east, gave the whole thing roughly the silhouette of a boot, narrow at the north end and broader across the middle. "It is," Wade said. Noah seemed pleased to have noticed this. He pointed to the ridge marked on the north end. "What's up there?" "Pine. Elk in the fall. Used to camp up there when I was about your age." "With your father?" The word landed strangely. "Yes," Wade said. "With my father." Noah absorbed this. "Was he nice?" he asked. Wade considered the question with more honesty than he usually applied to it. "He was better when he was working than when he wasn't," he said. "He knew how to do things. He was good at teaching what he knew." Noah nodded as though this was a satisfying answer, And maybe it was. He turned back to the map, and Wade stood next to him at the desk. And they stayed there a while in the lamplight, not talking, just looking at the shape of the land. The fence on the northwest corner took 2 full days to repair properly, with the ground frozen and the posts needing to be sledge-driven through a foot of frost. Wade worked alongside Denny and Russ, his hands going numb in the leather gloves and the breath coming out in clouds. And on the second afternoon, Denny said, without preamble, "That woman can cook." "I know," Wade said. "I didn't think she could," Denny admitted. "I was wrong." "I know that too," Wade said. Denny drove another post in silence. Then, "Kid's all right." Wade said nothing. "Quiet kid," Denny said. "Doesn't bother you. That's better than most." "He's 4, Wade said. 4 going on 40, Denny said, which was accurate enough that Wade didn't argue with it. He went back to driving posts, and the cold came down harder. And somewhere to the northwest, the sky was building something that would take another week to arrive, but was already visible to anyone who knew what to look for. A coming weight, a pressure dropping slow and heavy over the mountains. Inside the house, in the warm kitchen, Hannah was making something that smelled of onion and sage, and Noah was at the table with his piece of wood, and the lamp was lit against the early dark, and the whole picture of it, visible through the window as Wade came in across the yard at the end of the day, was something he had no name for. He stood in the cold for a moment longer than he needed to, looking at it. Then he went inside. The snow came the way it always came in that valley, not announcing itself, not building gradually the way weather did in more reasonable parts of the country, but arriving overnight like something that had made up its mind while you were sleeping. Wade woke to 8 inches on the ground and more falling, and by the time he'd gotten his boots on and made it downstairs, Hannah already had the stove going and coffee on and was standing at the kitchen window watching the yard disappear under white. "How bad is it going to get?" she asked, without turning around. "Bad enough," he said. He poured coffee and stood beside her. The barn was barely visible from where they stood, maybe 40 feet away, which told him the visibility was already poor and getting worse. "Might be 3 days. Might be a week. I've got stores for 2 weeks if we're careful," she said. 3 if I stretch it." He looked at her sideways. She'd already thought through it. He didn't know why that surprised him. She thought through most things before they became problems. But it did. "I need to get the cattle pushed tighter into the south shelter," he said, "before this gets worse." "Then you should go do that," she said, and handed him a biscuit wrapped in cloth without looking at him, which was the Hannah Cross version of saying be careful without saying anything so vulnerable as that. He took it and went. The work in a blizzard was a different category of hard than the regular kind. The cold had teeth in it, the kind that got through the layers after the first hour and settled into the joints and stayed there. Wade worked with Cal and Denny driving the cattle, while Russ kept the barn doors and the path between the main buildings clear enough to navigate. They lost 3 hours to a steer that had pushed through a gap in the south fence and gone a quarter mile into the timber before they found him, standing in a pine grove with the specific expression of an animal that has no concept of consequence. "Stupid creature," Denny said, with the frost thick on his mustache. "He's alive," Cal said. "Barely a reason." They got him back. They got everything back that first day, which was the best you could hope for. Wade came in after dark with ice in his hair and a bone-deep exhaustion that was almost peaceful in its totality, the kind of tired that left no room for anything else. Hannah had kept supper warm. She set it on the table without ceremony, and Wade sat down and ate without taking off his coat for the first 5 minutes because his hands weren't responding properly to instructions yet. Noah watched him from across the table with that observant quiet he had. "Your nose is red," Noah said. "It's cold outside," Wade said. Cal's nose was red too. "Cal's nose is usually red," Wade said, and Noah considered this with the gravity of a scientist cataloging a phenomenon. Hannah brought more coffee and sat down herself, which was something she'd started doing in the second week, eating with them instead of eating after, standing at the counter the way hired help usually did. Wade had noticed the shift but said nothing about it, and neither had the men, which amounted to a collective acceptance of the arrangement. "Lost a section of fence at the south corner," Wade told Cal across the table. "Going to need to get to it when this breaks." "Already on my list," Cal said. "Everything's on your list," Denny said. That's why things get done, Cal said mildly. Denny had no answer for this. Later, after the men had gone back to the bunkhouse and Noah was in bed, Wade sat at the kitchen table with the account books again, which had become a habit. Not because he enjoyed it, but because the kitchen was warmer than the office, and he admitted to himself, because Hannah was usually still in the kitchen at that hour, doing whatever the end-of-day kitchen work required. They had developed a kind of quiet companionship in those late hours that neither of them had named or discussed. She moved around the kitchen, he sat at the table with his books, and occasionally one of them said something and the other answered, and then they went back to their respective tasks. It wasn't nothing. He wasn't sure what it was, but it wasn't nothing. "You're going to wear a hole in that page," she said from across the kitchen, without looking up from the pot she was scrubbing. He looked down. He'd been staring at the same column of numbers for 10 minutes. "The March payment," he said, without deciding to say it. She set the pot down and turned around, leaned against the counter. "How much?" He told her. The number sat in the warm kitchen air like something too big for the space. She didn't react with alarm, which he appreciated. She just looked at the number as though it were a problem to be broken down rather than a wall to run into. "Can you sell anything before March?" "Not cattle. Not in this condition. Spring weight would be better." "Land?" "Not to Hale," he said. "I won't sell to Hale." She nodded once, slowly, as though she'd already expected that answer and approved of it. "What about timber rights on the North Ridge?" He hadn't thought about that. He sat back and turned it over. There was a logging operation over near Helena that had been moving east. It was possible, not certain, but possible, that the pine on the North Ridge was worth something to them as a lease arrangement, which would be money without giving up the land. "It's worth looking into," he said. "You've been sitting with this problem alone," she said. Not an accusation, just an observation. "It's my problem," he said. "I know it is," she said. I'm just saying, some problems get smaller when you say them out loud." He looked at her across the kitchen, and she looked back, and the lamp between them threw a yellow circle of light, and the snow pressed against the windows, and the house made the sounds houses make in deep cold, the small creaks and settlings of timber contracting. "It got a little smaller," he admitted. She nodded and picked up the pot again. "Good," she said. "Now, let me finish this." He told her about Noah on a Sunday. He had been building toward it for 3 weeks, turning the right words over in his head and finding each set of them inadequate in some way. And eventually he decided that there were no right words and the wrong words said plainly were better than nothing. He found her in the barn. She'd taken to helping with the horses in the morning, not because anyone asked, but because the barn was part of the operation, and Hannah Cross apparently saw the operation as a whole thing rather than a collection of separate jurisdictions. She was brushing out a roan mare that had been with the ranch for 8 years and had opinions about everything. "I've been thinking about what to do," he said. He stood with his hands in his pockets, which was something he rarely did. He was usually doing something with his hands. "About the situation, about Noah." She kept brushing. "All right," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I handled any of this well," he said. "Laramie, the way I left. I'm not going to make excuses for it. I didn't ask for excuses. I know I'm not offering them. I'm just saying, I know what it cost you. Probably. I can guess." He paused. "A woman alone with a child, no support, working roadhouses and mining camps. That's not easy." "No," she said. "It wasn't." "I want to make it right," he said. "Not because I feel obligated. I do feel obligated, but that's not the reason. The reason is—" He stopped, started again. "He's a good boy. He deserves a father. I haven't been one, but I want to be one, if you'll let me try." Hannah stopped brushing. The mare turned her head and looked at Wade with large, unimpressed brown eyes. "What does that mean exactly?" Hannah said. "Trying to be one." "It means he stays," Wade said. "Both of you. Permanent. Not as hired help, as—" He didn't have the word. He searched for it and came up short. "As people who belong here." Hannah turned to face him. There was something working in her expression that she was controlling carefully. Not cold, just careful. "You're talking about changing the arrangement." "Yes." "You barely know us." "I know enough," he said. "I know he's mine, and I know—" He stopped again. This was the part that was harder. I know that you've handled things for 5 years that were my responsibility, and you never asked me for anything, and you're not asking now, and I'm asking anyway. She was quiet for a long time. The mare bumped her shoulder with her nose, looking for the brush, and Hannah absently resumed brushing without breaking eye contact with Wade. I need to think about it, she said finally. That's fair, he said. It's not a small thing you're asking. I know it isn't. You're asking me to give Noah a reason to expect something from you, she said. And if you decide it's too hard or too strange, or you change your mind in 6 months, it's not you who pays for that. It's him. The words were direct, and they were supposed to sting, and they did. I know, he said. Do you? Yes, he said. I know what it is to grow up waiting for something from your father that doesn't come. I know exactly what that is. Something in her face shifted, not softened exactly, but opened slightly, like a door unlocked but not yet pushed. She turned back to the mare and finished the brushing in silence, and Wade stood in the barn doorway with the cold behind him and the warm hay smell around him and waited. I'll think about it, she said again, and this time it sounded different. Chub. He told Noah himself that evening. He'd asked Hannah if he could, and she'd given him a long measuring look and then said yes, and he understood that this was a test of some kind, not a malicious one, but a real one. She wanted to see how he did it. He brought Noah out to the barn after supper, just the two of them. It was the boys' favorite place now, after 3 weeks of Cal's informal teaching tours. Noah moved among the horses with a confidence that was new, touching noses and checking the water troughs with the proprietary air of someone who has decided something belongs to him. I need to tell you something, Wade said. He'd sat down on a hay bale so he was closer to the boy's height. It's something important. Noah stopped and looked at him. He didn't fill the silence with questions, just waited, which was, Wade thought, a more adult way to handle it than most adults managed. I'm your father, Wade said. I didn't know about you until recently. That's not an excuse. There are things I should have done differently, and I didn't do them. But I know now, and I want you to know. Noah's expression didn't change dramatically. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Wade for a long time with those storm-gray eyes that were the same storm-gray as Wade's own. Mama knew? He said. She knew there was a chance, Wade said. She came here to make sure. Noah thought about this. Did she tell you? I figured it out myself, Wade said. Your eyes. Noah's hand went to his face briefly, touching the corner of one eye, as though he'd forgotten what color they were. Then he dropped his hand. Are you going to go away? He asked. The directness of it hit Wade somewhere in the chest. No, he said. This is my ranch. I'm not going anywhere. The question is whether you and your mother stay. Do we get to decide? Your mother decides, Wade said. She's in charge of that. Noah processed this with characteristic gravity. Then, what do I call you? Wade hadn't thought about that. He sat with it for a moment. What do you want to call me? He said. Noah thought. I'll think about it, he said, which was so precisely his mother's phrase delivered in his mother's tone that Wade almost laughed. That seems fair, he said. Noah went back to checking the water troughs, and Wade sat on the hay bale in the lamplight, and the horses shifted and breathed around them, and he thought, I have a son. He thought it plainly, without drama, just setting it down in the space of his mind like a fact that needed to be placed somewhere before he could move around it. I have a son. He's 4 years old, and he sounds like his mother, and he's going to call me something I haven't earned yet, and I'm going to earn it. He sat there until Noah was done with his rounds, and then they walked back to the house together. Hannah's answer came 4 days later, not in words but in action, which was how Hannah Cross usually communicated the things that mattered most. She rearranged the upstairs rooms. The ranch house had 4 rooms on the second floor. The master bedroom where Wade slept, 2 smaller rooms that had been used for storage since his parents died, and a narrow room at the end of the hall that had been a sewing room once. Hannah had been sleeping in one of the storage rooms with Noah, using a spare mattress and the furniture that had been shoved against the wall. Wade had offered her better, and she'd declined at the time. On a Thursday morning, he came upstairs to find that she had cleared the larger of the 2 storage rooms, moved Noah's pallet and her own things into it, and converted the sewing room at the end of the hall into a space for Noah alone, small but real, with a nail on the wall for his coat and a shelf for his piece of wood and the Harper's Weekly magazines. It was the most she was going to say about the decision, and they both knew it. That evening, he found a note on the kitchen table, written in her clear, practical handwriting. "We're staying. Don't make me regret it." He put the note in the desk drawer with the bank letter and the letter from Hale, which seemed like the right place for the things that mattered. Done. Victor Hale sent a second letter in December. This one was less polite. The offer was the same price, but the language around it had changed. Phrases like, "before conditions deteriorate further," and "the bank's position may not remain favorable," that were dressed as concern, but were obviously meant as pressure. There was a line near the end that said Hale would be in the area in the new year and hoped to discuss the matter in person. Wade read it at the kitchen table with Cal sitting across from him. "He's circling," Cal said. "He's been circling for 3 years," Wade said. "He's just saying it more plainly now." Word from the Darby place is that Hale's men cut their east fence twice last month and scared off their cattle. Davis had to gather for 2 days. Wade looked up. "He do anything about it?" "What's he going to do?" Cal said. "Sheriff Pike would take Hale's side on a clear day with witnesses and a sworn statement. Davis knows that." This was the thing about Victor Hale that made him particularly difficult to fight. He operated just inside the line of what you could prove in a county where the law bent toward money. The fence cutting could be argued as vandalism by parties unknown. The lost cattle could be argued as drift. He pushed without leaving fingerprints on the pushing. "I need to know what he actually owns," Wade said. "Not what he claims. The actual recorded titles. I've been hearing he's been buying up things that weren't fully legal to sell." Cal was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you hear that?" "From Jonas Whitfield over at the hardware," Wade said. "Which means it's either true or it's a rumor that has enough truth in it to be going around. Either way, it's worth looking into." "You'd have to go to the county seat to pull those records." "I know. That's a 2-day trip in winter." "I know that too," Wade said. He didn't make the trip immediately. The ranch needed him present, and December was not the month for unnecessary travel. But he filed it away. He was building a picture, adding to it piece by piece, the way you built a case against a cold problem. You couldn't charge at Victor Hale directly. The man had money and legal cover and a county official in his pocket. If you were going to take him down, you had to find the foundation he was standing on and look at it very carefully. Christmas came without ceremony. There was no tradition of particular celebration in the Mercer household. His father had treated holidays as a mild inconvenience, and Wade had carried that forward without examining it. But Hannah made a meal that stopped conversation for 10 minutes through sheer quality, and Cal produced a bottle of whiskey from some private reserve and poured small glasses all around, including a very small glass for Denny that he immediately declared insufficient, and Cal declined to improve. Noah received a gift from Cal, a proper jackknife with a bone handle, not the dull blade he'd been using for the whittling. He held it with both hands and looked at it with an expression of almost painful seriousness. "That's a real knife," Cal told him, "which means real rules. You don't point it at living things, you don't open it indoors, and when you're done you close it and you put it away." "Yes, sir," Noah said. "Good." Noah carefully closed the knife and put it in his shirt pocket, and Cal nodded once, and that was that. Wade watched this from across the room and felt the particular sensation of being shown something he'd missed, the way a man like Cal Briggs, who had no children and had probably told himself for 40 years that this was fine, extended himself toward this boy with a patience and attention that wasn't about obligation. It was just care, plain and uncomplicated. He looked at Hannah. She was watching Cal and Noah too, and her face had the look it got sometimes when she was feeling something she didn't intend to show. Slightly too still, like a surface with a current underneath it. He said her name quietly, just her name. She glanced at him. He didn't have anything ready to say. He'd said her name before he'd thought about why. "Thanks for the meal," he said, which was what came out. Something in her face moved the way it did when she was working to keep the smile small. "Don't thank me. Thank the elk," she said. He did smile at that, just barely. The second week of January brought weather that made November look mild. The temperature dropped to 15 below and stayed there for 9 days, and the ranch became a survival operation, keeping the animals alive, keeping the pipes from freezing solid, keeping the path between the house and bunkhouse passable. Wade slept 5 hours a night if he was lucky, and spent the rest in the barn or the yard or the south field where the cattle were pressing against each other in the shelter belts for warmth. He lost 2 steers to the cold. Old animals probably wouldn't have made the spring market anyway, but still a loss. The water line from the main well froze solid on the 5th day, and they were hauling water by hand for 4 days until Wade and Russ got deep enough in the ground to thaw the pipe. It was on the 8th day, a Tuesday, that Wade came in at noon after 5 hours in the bone-cracking cold and found Hannah sitting at the kitchen table with Noah's head in her lap. The boy was pale, and his breathing had the shallow, rapid quality of something wrong, and Hannah had her hand on his forehead, and her face had lost its composure entirely. "He started this morning," she said. "I thought it was the cold. His chest—" She stopped. Her voice had done something it was not supposed to do. Wade crossed the kitchen and put his hand on Noah's forehead. The heat was alarming. "How long has he had the fever?" "Since last night. I didn't want to—" She stopped again. "I thought it would break. Has it broken at all?" "No." He straightened up. He was thinking fast. The nearest doctor was in Dillon, 12 miles in a blizzard, which was not nothing. It was a serious ride in this weather, possibly 2 hours each way in current conditions, with no guarantee the doctor would be in. But the alternative was watching the fever climb and hoping. "I'm going for the doctor," he said. "The weather—" "I know," he said. "I'm still going." He was already pulling his coat back on. Hannah stood up, and for a moment she looked like she was going to argue. And then she looked at Noah and stopped looking like she was going to argue. "Take the bay," she said. "He handles cold better than the others." "I know which horse to take," he said, not unkindly. "Wade." She said his name the way he'd said hers at Christmas, just the name, nothing attached to it. He looked at her. "Be careful," she said. This time she said it plainly, without converting it into something else. "I'll be back before dark," he said. He wasn't back before dark. He was back 4 hours later, which was close enough with Dr. Emmett Crane from Dillon, who complained about the cold continuously for the entire return ride, and then, upon seeing Noah, stopped complaining and became a completely different person. Focused and quick-handed and competent in the way doctors are, when the situation requires it. The diagnosis was a chest infection, bad but not catastrophic. Crane left medicine and instructions and a list of things to watch for. And he charged Wade an amount that was fair for a house call in a blizzard, and Wade paid it without discussion because some things you didn't negotiate. Noah slept most of the next 3 days. Hannah did not leave his room. She slept in the chair by his bed, and Wade brought her food that she ate without appearing to taste it. And once, when he came up with coffee at midnight, he found her sitting in the dark with her hand on the boy's chest, just feeling him breathe, and he set the coffee down quietly and left without saying anything, because there was nothing to say. On the 4th day, Noah woke up and asked for breakfast. Hannah came downstairs and stood at the kitchen counter and was very still for about 30 seconds, and then she turned around and said, "He wants biscuits." "I'll start the stove," Wade said. "I've got it," she said, and her voice was back to normal, or almost, and she got to work. Wade went upstairs and sat on the edge of the small bed and looked at Noah, who was still pale but present, his eyes clear and his appetite apparently intact. "You scared your mother," Wade said. "I know," Noah said. "I'm sorry." "You don't apologize for being sick," Wade said. "You just get better." Noah looked at him for a moment. "You went and got the doctor," he said. "Yes." "In the blizzard?" "Yes." Noah was quiet. Then, "Cal says you rode 12 miles in the bad weather." "Cal talks too much," Wade said. Noah almost smiled. It was the first time Wade had seen anything close to a smile on the boy's face in 4 days, and it hit him like a physical thing, somewhere below the ribs. "Wade," Noah said. It was the first time he'd used the name. He'd been saying sir and occasionally mister, and mostly nothing at all, navigating around the question of what to call him the way he navigated most difficult things, by going around it until he was ready. "Yeah," Wade said. "Thank you," Noah said. They sat there a moment. "Get some more sleep," Wade said. "Your mother's making biscuits." "Okay," Noah said, and closed his eyes, and was asleep again in about 40 seconds. Wade sat there a little longer than he needed to, and then got up and went downstairs. In the 3rd week of January, two things happened on the same day that Wade would later think of as the moment the real trouble began. The first was a visit from Tom Garrity, who ran the spread directly west of the Mercer Ranch, a smaller operation than Wade's, cattle and some horses. And Garrity was a decent man who minded his own business and was therefore someone Wade trusted. He came by in the morning with a look on his face that meant he hadn't come for social reasons. "Hale's men were at my east boundary yesterday," Garrity said, standing in the yard. "4 of them, just standing there, not doing anything you could point to, just standing there looking at my place like they were measuring it." "Same as Davis," Wade said. "Same as Davis," Garrity agreed. "I've heard 3 other places have had the same. Morrison over on the north end, the Yee brothers up by the ridge, and old Mrs. Calloway on the flat." He paused. "He's moving. He's getting ready to push in earnest." "What are you going to do?" Wade asked. "That's what I came to ask you," Garrity said. This was a different kind of question than it appeared. Garrity wasn't asking for permission or orders. He was asking whether Wade was going to lead, because in a valley that had been frightened into passivity for 3 years, someone had to stand first, and the remaining ranchers had apparently decided that someone was Wade. He didn't particularly want this. He also didn't see how to decline it without being the kind of man he didn't want to be. "Tell the others to hold their ground," Wade said. "Don't sell, don't negotiate, don't let his men push your cattle or cut your fences without documenting it exactly. Date, time, what they did, who was there. Write it down." "And then what?" "Then we have something," Wade said. "Come back in 2 weeks." The second thing was a rider from Hale's operation, a thick-necked man named Burkett, who Wade had seen twice before in town and liked neither time. Burkett arrived an hour after Garrity left, riding up to the main house without being invited and stopping in the yard. "Mr. Hale would like an answer," Burkett said, not getting off his horse. The not getting off his horse was deliberate. It was a message about how much of his time this errand was worth. "Mr. Hale can want a lot of things," Wade said. "He's been patient." "That's his choice." Burkett looked at him with the flat professional assessment of a man who worked through intimidation as a standard business tool. "This ranch is underwater," he said. "Bank's going to call your note in March. Mr. Hale is offering you a way to walk away with something instead of nothing." "I appreciate the concern," Wade said. "Mr. Mercer." Burkett's voice dropped slightly. "There are ways this gets harder." "Are there?" Wade said. It wasn't a question. "There are," Burkett said. He rode out without another word, and Wade watched him go, and the cold pressed down from the ridge, and somewhere behind him he heard the kitchen door open. "Who was that?" Hannah said. "Hale's man," Wade said. She came to stand beside him, and they watched the rider shrink against the white landscape. "What did he say?" she asked. "The usual," he said. In the polite version, there was an impolite version underneath it. She was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" He thought about Garrity's question and the answer he'd given, about documented evidence and holding ground and having something to work with. He thought about the records at the county seat and the question of what Hale actually owned versus what he claimed to own. "I need to go to the county seat," he said. "I've been putting it off." "When?" "Next week," he said, "if the weather holds." She nodded. Then she said, "I want you to take Cal." "I was planning to." "And I want you to tell me what you find," she said. "I'm not part of the furniture here. If this affects the ranch, it affects all of us." He turned to look at her. She was looking at him with that steady, direct gaze, the one she'd had on the first day at the stage stop, the one that was taking his measure and not finding it wanting, but not finding it complete either. "When I get back," he said, "I'll tell you everything I find." She held his gaze a moment longer. "Good," she said, and went back inside. He stood in the cold yard a little longer. The rider was gone now, a small, dark shape absorbed into the white distance, and the valley was quiet, and the ranch was quiet around him. The horses breathing in the barn and the smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney, and the sound of Noah's voice somewhere inside the house, recovered, alive, talking to no one in particular about something he found interesting. Wade turned and went back inside, and the door closed behind him, and the cold had to wait. Wade and Cal rode to the county seat on a Wednesday in the last week of January, when the weather gave them a narrow window. Not warm, nothing close to warm, but the wind had dropped and the sky had the hard, clear quality that meant no new snow for at least 2 days. They left before first light and made Dillon by mid-morning, and Wade went straight to the county recorder's office while Cal saw to the horses and picked up supplies. The recorder was a thin man named Aldous Fitch, who had the particular energy of someone who had spent 30 years in a small room with documents and had made his peace with it. He was not unfriendly, but he was precise in the way that men become precise when precision is the only power available to them. "Hale Land and Cattle Company," Wade said. "I want to see every recorded title, every transfer deed, every easement filed under that name or any variation of it in this county." Fitch looked at him over his glasses. "That's a considerable amount of paper." "I've got time," Wade said. It took 2 hours. Fitch pulled the records and Wade sat at the long table in the back room and went through them systematically, the way he went through the account books, not looking for something specific yet, just building the map of it, understanding the shape before looking for the cracks. The shape was impressive on the surface. Hale had acquired 31 parcels in 4 years, a consolidation of nearly 40,000 acres that represented roughly a third of the usable grazing land in the valley and the 2 adjacent drainages. The purchases were documented, the deeds filed, everything in apparent order. But somewhere around the 14th parcel, Wade started noticing something. 3 of the transfers bore the signature of a man named Cornelius Webb as the selling party's legal representative. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that Webb had apparently represented sellers on 3 separate transactions involving 3 entirely different families: the Lundqvists, a widow named Pratt, and a man called Soren Foss, all within the same 6-month window. Wade had been on the frontier long enough to know that a lawyer representing multiple parties in a series of related transactions was either very busy or something else entirely. He went back through the records a second time, slower. The Lundqvist sale was dated March 1880. The Pratt sale, April 1880. The Foss sale, June 1880. In each case, the purchase price was below assessed value, significantly below in the Pratt case, by nearly 40%. In each case, the seller's representative was Webb. Wade wrote down the names. He wrote down the dates and the prices and the parcel numbers. He wrote down Webb's name 4 times and underlined it. "Do you know a lawyer named Cornelius Webb?" he asked Fitch when the recorder came back to check on him. Fitch went very still in the particular way of a man who knows more than he wants to say in a public capacity. "He practiced here for a time," Fitch said carefully. "He's no longer in the county." "Where did he go?" "I couldn't say," Fitch said, and returned to his desk. Wade looked at the records for another hour. By the time he left, he had 7 pages of notes and a clear enough picture to know 2 things. Victor Hale's land empire had at least 3 transactions in it that bore the marks of fraud. Sellers represented by a lawyer who was either incompetent, corrupt, or both, at prices that suggested the sellers hadn't known the real value of what they were signing away. And Hale had been careful enough to keep his own name 1 step back from the mechanism. His name was always on the buying end, never on the pressure end, which meant the records alone weren't enough. The records showed a pattern. To prove the pattern was fraud, you needed the mechanism, the correspondence, the internal agreements, the paper trail that showed Hale directing Webb rather than simply buying land that happened to become available. That paper was not at the county recorder's office. That paper, if it existed, was in Hale's possession. Cal was waiting outside with the horses. He took one look at Wade's face. "You found something," Cal said. "I found the shape of something," Wade said. "The proof is somewhere else." "Where?" "His office," Wade said. "Or his house. Somewhere he keeps his business records." Cal was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking about going and getting it," he said. "I'm thinking about it," Wade said. "That's not legal." "No," Wade said. "It isn't." Cal chewed on this for the length of time it took them to get the horses watered and ready to ride. Then he said, "When you're thinking about doing the not legal part, you let me know." "Cal, I've been writing for the Mercer Ranch for 16 years, Cal said. "Your father before you, and you. I'm not going to stand back and watch Hale take it." He looked at Wade with the flat certainty of a man who has decided something and finished deciding it. "You let me know." Wade looked at him. "All right," he said. "I'll let you know." They rode home into the falling dark, and the cold came back with the sunset, and Wade turned the problem over in his mind the whole way, working it the way you work a knot. Not pulling at it, just learning where the tension was. He told Hannah that night. He'd promised he would, and he did, spreading his notes on the kitchen table after Noah was in bed, and walking her through what he'd found, the names and dates and prices, and the pattern underneath them. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about her that he had come to rely on. She listened to the whole thing before she responded, didn't jump to the middle and assume she knew the end. "Webb was working for Hale," she said when he'd finished. "That's my read," Wade said, presenting himself as an independent advocate for the sellers while actually managing the transaction on Hale's behalf, getting them to sign at low prices, possibly telling them the assessed values were lower than they were, possibly manufacturing urgency. The Pratt widow is still alive, lives over near Wisdom. If someone asked her the right questions, she might not remember clearly, Hannah said. Or she might not want to talk about it. People who've been taken advantage of often don't. "I know," Wade said. "The testimony alone wouldn't be enough anyway. We need the correspondence between Hale and Webb." "Which is in his possession," she said. "Yes." She was quiet. She looked at his notes, then she looked at him. "You're going to try to get it," she said. "It's the only way to take him down permanently," Wade said. "A pattern in public records is something his lawyers can argue around. His own letters to Webb or something else." "It's dangerous," she said. "I know." "If you're caught on his property." "I know," he said again. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked at him again. "What does Cal say?" "Cal's in." "Of course he is," she said, without particular surprise, because Cal Briggs's loyalty was not a variable anyone who knew him calculated for. "I'm not asking your permission," Wade said. "Not sharp, just clear." "I know you're not," she said, equally clear. "I'm not offering it. I'm telling you that you should think it through completely before you do it, because if something goes wrong, Noah loses the father he just found, and She stopped. He waited. She didn't finish the sentence. She looked at her hands on the table instead, and then looked back up. "Think it through," she said. "That's all." He thought it through for 2 more weeks. Hale's main operation was headquartered 12 miles north at a place called Ridgeline, a compound of buildings behind a timber fence that had started as a working ranch and had been expanded over the years into something that looked more like a small fort. Wade had been past it on the road twice and had never had occasion to look closely. He looked closely now. He spent 3 evenings over the course of 10 days riding the perimeter road at different hours, not stopping, not making it obvious, just looking. He learned where the bunkhouse was relative to the main house. He learned that Hale kept 2 dogs that ran loose at night. He learned that the man who made the last round of the property each night did it at 10 o'clock and was back inside by 10:30. And that after 10:30, the compound was dark and stayed dark until the cook's lamp came on at 5 in the morning. He learned that Hale's office was in the main house, second window from the right on the ground floor, which you could tell because the lamp in that room was on later than any other, sometimes past midnight. He discussed all of this with Cal in the barn, away from the house, in voices low enough that they were barely audible over the horses. "The dogs are the problem," Cal said. "The dogs are a problem," Wade agreed. "Not the only one." "When are you thinking?" "Next clear night with no moon," Wade said, "which the almanac says is 10 days from now." Cal nodded. "I'll ride the outside. Keep the horses ready. You go in." "It should be 1 person inside," Wade said. "Less noise, less chance." "I'm not arguing the logic," Cal said. "I'm saying I ride the outside and keep the horses, and if something goes wrong in there, I'm the one who comes in after you. That's how it works." Wade didn't argue. He knew when Cal had made up his mind. "What does Hannah know?" Cal asked. "She knows enough," Wade said. "She doesn't know the date." "You gonna tell her?" He thought about her face at the kitchen table, the sentence she hadn't finished. "Yes," he said, "before we go." The night came on a Thursday in the second week of February, moonless and still and cold enough that the snow had crusted to a crust that would creak underfoot but wouldn't give way. Wade told Hannah at supper, just the fact of it. Tonight, he and Cal, back before morning. She nodded once. She didn't look at him through the rest of the meal. When he came downstairs at 9 o'clock with his coat on and his boots in his hand to avoid noise, she was in the kitchen. She had a cloth bundle on the table, bread and dried meat, something hot in a flask. "You don't have to he started. "I know I don't," she said. She was not looking at him directly. She was looking at the table. "Come back," she said. Just that. "I will," he said. She picked up the cloth bundle and held it out without looking up. He took it. Their fingers were close on the cloth, and neither of them moved for a moment, and the kitchen was very quiet. Then he went. They rode in silence, two shapes against the white landscape, the horse's breath coming in slow clouds. The road to the north was empty. The valley was asleep. The cold was serious but not punishing, just cold enough to keep you sharp, which was what you needed. They left the road a mile south of Ridgeline and moved through the timber on the east side, Wade on foot from the last stand of pine, Cal staying with the horses at the tree line. The compound was dark and still, exactly as it had been on the nights he'd watched it. The timber fence had a section on the east side where two posts had spread apart slightly, enough for a man to turn sideways. He turned sideways and went through. The dogs were the first problem. He'd brought dried meat in his pocket, not the bundle Hannah had packed, which was for the road, but specific pieces he'd cut that afternoon and treated with nothing, because the point was just to give the dogs something to think about. The first dog found him at the corner of the bunkhouse, a big mixed breed that lowered its head and made a sound in its chest that was not quite a growl. Wade crouched and held out the meat. The dog's nose worked. It took 2 steps forward. It took the meat. The second dog came around the other side of the bunkhouse and watched this transaction, and then looked at Wade with the expression of an animal recalibrating. Wade held out more meat. The second dog took it. They weren't guard dogs in any trained sense. They were ranch dogs assigned a task they performed by instinct rather than discipline, which meant they could be redirected with the right currency. Wade moved past them toward the main house, and they followed him for 20 feet, hoping for more meat, and then lost interest and went back toward the bunkhouse warmth. The window he wanted was latched but not locked, a common error in a place where the locked gate was considered security enough. He worked the latch with a thin piece of metal he'd brought for the purpose, a skill his father would not have approved of, and that he'd acquired at 17 from a man of questionable character who'd worked the ranch one summer, and the window swung inward without a sound. He was inside in under a minute. The office was a working room, not a showy one. Filing cabinets along the east wall, a large desk, shelves of ledgers. The cold from outside followed him in, and he left the window open 2 inches against the possibility of needing to leave quickly. He lit a match, shielded it with his palm, and moved it over the filing cabinet labels. Hale organized his records by property parcel, not alphabetical, not chronological, by parcel number, which was the system of a man who thought of land primarily as an inventory item. Wade found the Lundqvist parcel, the Pratt parcel, the Foss parcel without difficulty. What he found inside was better than he'd hoped. Victor Hale was a man who kept copies of everything, perhaps because he didn't trust Webb entirely, perhaps because he was the kind of man who maintained leverage over his own instruments. Whatever the reason, in the Lundqvist file was a letter from Hale to Webb dated February 1880, 2 months before the sale, that laid out in specific and direct language exactly what Webb was to tell the Lundqvists about the assessed value of their land, which was lower than the actual assessed value by 30%, and what to tell them about the bank's position on their existing loan, which was apparently more threatening than the bank had actually indicated. Wade read it by matchlight, burning through 4 matches. Then he read the corresponding letters in the Pratt and Foss files. The pattern was consistent. Hale directing Webb to present false information to sellers in order to manufacture urgency and suppress the sale price. It was fraud in writing, in Hale's own hand signed with his full name. He took every letter he could identify as relevant, 11 documents in total, and folded them inside his coat. He put the files back the way he'd found them. He checked the desk for anything else and found a ledger that appeared to track payments to Webb across a span of 4 years, amounts that corresponded to acquisition dates, which was additional evidence of the arrangement. He took the relevant pages from the ledger, which was a risk because Hale might notice, but the letters alone were enough, and the ledger pages would make the picture complete. He was at the window inside 20 minutes. The dogs were back. One of them raised its head from where it had settled near the bunkhouse door and watched him cross the yard with the focused attention of an animal, deciding whether something required action. Wade didn't run. Running makes dogs chase. He walked at a normal pace, and the dog watched him, and he went sideways through the fence gap and was in the timber. He found Cal exactly where he'd left him. "You got something," Cal said, reading his face. "I got everything," Wade said, and they moved. They were 6 miles south of Ridgeline when the sound of horses reached them from behind. Wade heard it first, the particular rhythm of riders moving fast, not the casual sound of someone on a night errand, but the purposeful drumming of pursuit. He didn't know how Hale had been alerted. Maybe someone had been awake in the house. Maybe the dogs had made more noise than he'd thought after he'd left. Maybe there was a third dog he hadn't accounted for. It didn't matter. "How far back?" Cal said. Wade listened. "Half mile? Maybe less." "We can't outrun them in this." The crusted snow that had been an advantage on foot was a liability on horseback. The horses were breaking through with every stride, working twice as hard as they should, and they'd been out for 2 hours already. Hale's men would be fresher, and their horses would be fresher. "The creek," Wade said. "Harlan's Run," Cal said. "It's a mile west. In ice condition," Wade said. "We ride the creek bed south. They lose the tracks." Cal didn't argue. They turned west into the open field, cutting across the crusted surface at an angle, and behind them the sound of the pursuit grew and then shifted, riders reaching the point where they'd turned and slowing to read the tracks. The creek was running, or had been, a thin channel of water visible in the center under a shelf of ice that extended from both banks. The ice shelf was a foot wide on each side, and the horses didn't like it, didn't like the sound it made under their weight, but they went. They rode south in this creek bed for 40 minutes, the horses blowing hard, the cold biting through everything. The pursuit sounds faded behind them. The riders had stayed on the land, reading tracks that ended at the creek bank and then circled, trying to find where they'd come out. When Wade was certain they'd lost them, they came out of the creek half a mile above the Mercer property line and covered the remaining distance to the ranch at a walk, letting the horses recover. The house was dark except for the kitchen lamp. She was there, the same way she'd been there the first morning in the blizzard, at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark. When they came into the yard, she was at the door before they reached it. Wade came in and pulled the letters from inside his coat and set them on the kitchen table. Hannah looked at them. She picked up the first letter and read the first paragraph and put it back down. "That's enough," she said. "That's enough," Wade agreed. She looked at him, his face, his hands, checked him the way you check someone for damage when they've come back from somewhere dangerous. He had a cut on his left hand from the window latch, and she noticed it. "Sit down," she said. "It's not—" "Sit down," she said again, and got the cloth in the basin and cleaned the cut while he sat at the kitchen table with the document spread in front of him, and neither of them said much. And Cal stood in the doorway drinking coffee and not saying anything either, which was Cal's way of saying that things had come out the right way, and there was nothing to add. The next morning, Wade met with Tom Garrity. He didn't show him the letters, not yet, not until he'd decided the right sequence. But he told him what he'd found, the outline of it, the nature of the fraud. Garrity sat very still in the chair across from Wade's desk and looked at the wall for a long time. "He cheated the Lundqvists," Garrity said. "Yes. And Pratt. And Foss. Yes. How many others?" "I don't know yet," Wade said. "Possibly more." Garrity's jaw worked. He'd known the Lundqvists. They'd been in the valley for 2 generations before Hale had pushed them out. He'd been at the Lundqvist funeral 3 years ago, Elsa Lundqvist dying 6 months after they'd lost the ranch. And he'd thought it then, but hadn't known what to think against. "What do you need?" Garrity said. "A federal land office contact," Wade said. "Someone at the territorial level above Sheriff Pike, and someone to ride to Helena with the letters." "I can do the Helena part," Garrity said. "I need someone I can trust," Wade said, and then caught himself, because that was not what he'd meant to say. Garrity looked at him with a tired half-smile. "I know what you meant," he said. "You need someone Hale can't buy between here and Helena." "Yes," Wade said. "I've got a brother-in-law who works at the Territorial Land Commission," Garrity said. "He's been there 15 years, and he's not the kind of man Hale gets to. How fast can you get to Helena?" 2 days, Garrity said. "Maybe less if I push." "How fast can your brother-in-law act on it?" "That I can't promise," Garrity said. "But the letters you're describing, Hale's own hand directing specific misrepresentation to sellers, that's the kind of thing the federal men pay attention to. Land fraud's been a problem across the territory, and they've been looking for something solid. He paused. This is solid. Wade nodded. There's one more thing, he said. He pulled out the copy he'd made the previous night. He'd sat up after Hannah and Cal had gone to bed and made duplicate copies of the key letters in his own hand, a rough record in case anything happened to the originals. He put the originals in front of Garrity. These are the letters. These, he tapped a separate envelope, are copies in my hand, attesting to where I found them and how. Garrity looked at the envelope. You're keeping the originals. No, Wade said. I'm sending the originals with you. I'm keeping the copies here, and I'm distributing other copies to 2 people in town this afternoon who Hale doesn't own. If something happens to you on the road or to me before you get back, the evidence still exists in multiple places. Garrity looked at him for a moment. You've thought this through. I've had time, Wade said. Garrity took the letters and put them inside his coat, the same inside pocket where Wade had carried them the previous night. He stood up to leave and then stopped. Wade, he said, what happens if Hale figures out you have these before the federal men get here? Wade had thought about this. He'd been thinking about it since the ride home, since before that, since the moment he'd decided to go into that office. He'd looked at it from every side, and the answer was the same from every angle. He comes to get them, Wade said. And then? And then we don't give them to him, Wade said. Garrity left, and Wade sat at the desk, and outside the window the valley lay white and still under the February sky, the creek a dark line at the far edge of the property, the ridge north of them clean and hard against the blue. Somewhere in that direction, 12 miles up the valley, Victor Hale was going to wake up and find his office disturbed and his files short. 11 letters and several pages of a ledger, and he was going to know exactly where to look for them. The question was how fast he'd move, and whether Garrity could move faster. Wade looked at the ridge for a long time. Then he got up and went to find Cal, because there was a fence that needed reinforcing on the north boundary and 2 gates that needed new iron, and whatever was coming, it was going to find the Mercer Ranch as tight and hard as they could make it. You did what you could do. You fixed the fences, and you reinforced the gates, and you stayed at your work. And when the trouble came, you faced it from ground you'd prepared. He was pulling on his coat when Noah appeared at the bottom of the stairs, still in his socks, hair sideways from sleep. Where are you going? Noah said. Fence work, Wade said. North boundary. Can I come? Wade looked at him. The seriousness of him. The unconscious echo of Hannah in the set of his face. The gray eyes. Not today, he said. Stay close to the house. Noah read something in his face. He was good at that for a 5-year-old. Better than most grown men, actually. He didn't push. Okay, he said. Your mother up? She's making breakfast. Tell her I'll be back at noon, Wade said, and went out into the cold. Garrity had been gone 4 days when Hale's men came. Wade had expected it sooner. He'd spent the first 2 days after Garrity left in a state of compressed alertness, the kind that wears on a man, checking the ridgeline too often, listening for horses on the north road, watching Cal's face for the particular expression that meant Cal had heard something he hadn't. By the 3rd day, he'd made himself stop. You couldn't run a ranch in that condition, and you couldn't think straight in it either. He went back to work, kept Noah close to the house without explaining why, and waited. They came on a Thursday morning, 11 of them, riding in a line down the north road at a pace that was not hurried because it didn't need to be hurried. 11 men on fresh horses in good winter gear was a statement, not a question. They came through the main gate without stopping and pulled up in the yard in a rough half circle, and Victor Hale was at the center of them on a black horse that cost more than most men in the valley earned in 2 years. Wade had seen Hale twice at a distance and never close. He was a big man, broad across the chest, with a gray beard trimmed close and the particular bearing of someone who had decided a long time ago that his own judgment was the highest available authority. He was maybe 55, maybe older, and he sat his horse with the ease of a man who had been on horseback his whole life and expected to be on horseback when he died. Burkitt was beside him, the thick-necked man who'd come with the second letter. He looked at Wade with professional blankness. Cal was at the barn door. Denny and Russ had come out of the bunkhouse at the sound of horses, Russ still pulling on his coat. There were 3 men against 11, and all of them knew the arithmetic. Wade walked out into the yard and stopped. He didn't put his hands in his coat pockets. He kept them at his sides where they could be seen and where they were free. "Mr. Mercer?" Hale said. His voice was a rancher's voice, used to carrying across distances, used to being the loudest thing in a room. "You know why I'm here." "I can guess," Wade said. "Then let's not waste each other's time." Hale shifted in his saddle and looked at the ranch with the expression of a man doing a final assessment before a purchase closes. "You have something of mine. I want it back." "I don't know what you mean," Wade said. Hale looked at him. He was not a man who got angry easily. Anger was inefficient. Anger was for people who didn't have 11 riders at their back. He just looked at Wade with the flat certainty of someone who is accustomed to doors opening before he has to push them. "We can do this simply," Hale said. "You return what was taken from my office, I don't report the break-in to Sheriff Pike, and we go our separate ways." The offer on the ranch still stands. "I didn't break into your office," Wade said. "Wade." Hale's voice carried the particular patience of a man performing patience rather than feeling it. "I have a man who heard movement. I have tracks that led south toward your property line. I have filing cabinets with gaps in them that correspond exactly to the records you've been inquiring about at the county recorder's office." He paused. "I'm not accusing you in a court of law. I'm standing in your yard telling you that I know, and that you and I both know, and that we can resolve this like reasonable men." Wade said nothing. Hale let the silence sit for a moment and then nodded slightly as though this was an answer he'd expected. "Burkett," he said. Burkett swung down off his horse. Two of the other riders did the same. They moved toward the main house with the purposeful ease of men who had done this kind of work before. "Stop," Wade said. Burkett stopped and looked at him. "You're not going into that house," Wade said. "Mr. Mercer?" Burkett started. "There's a child in that house," Wade said. The words came out flat and certain, and something in them made Burkett hesitate, which was not something Burkett did by habit. Hale looked at him from the horse. Something shifted in his expression, not softened but recalibrated, the way a man recalibrates when he encounters a variable he hadn't planned for. "I'm not interested in the child," Hale said. "Then stay out of the house," Wade said. A beat of silence. The horses shifted. Somewhere behind Wade he could hear the kitchen door, and he kept his eyes on Hale and did not look back, but he knew the sound of that door. Hannah's voice came from the porch. "Noah, go upstairs and stay there." A small sound of footsteps, the inner door, and then quiet. "Mr. Hale," Hannah's voice, level and clear. Wade still didn't turn around. "Whatever business you have here is with Mr. Mercer. It doesn't concern the house." Hale looked past Wade toward the porch. His expression did the recalibrating thing again. He was a man who read situations. And what he was reading now was a woman who was not going to be moved by his 11 riders or his broad shoulders or his certainty, and who was furthermore standing on a porch with something in her hands that it took him a moment to identify as the kitchen rifle, a Winchester that Wade kept loaded above the door and that Hannah had apparently taken down with the quiet practicality she applied to everything. She wasn't pointing it at anyone, she was just holding it. Burkett looked at Hale. Hale looked at Hannah. Then Hale looked back at Wade. "Where are the letters?" Hale said. "What letters?" Wade said. Hale's jaw tightened. The first crack in the patience. "You are making a mistake," he said. "You are a man with a banknote due in March, a failing operation, and 3 hands. I have the sheriff, the county commissioner, and more lawyers than you can afford to fight. Whatever you think you have, I think I have documentation of land fraud," Wade said. 11 letters in your handwriting directing a lawyer named Cornelius Webb to misrepresent assessed values to sellers. A ledger of payments to Webb corresponding to acquisition dates. Enough to put the question of your land titles before a federal review. He paused. "And I think that documentation is no longer only in my possession." The yard went quiet, not the natural quiet of a cold morning, the specific quiet of men recalibrating. Hale looked at him with an expression that was for the first time something other than certainty. It was the expression of a man running numbers and not liking the sum. "You're bluffing," Hale said. "Maybe," Wade said. "You want to find out?" "But." This was the gamble, and Wade knew it as clearly as he'd ever known anything. He did not have confirmation that Garrity had reached Helena. He did not have confirmation that Garrity's brother-in-law had acted on the letters, or that the federal authorities had been engaged. He had copies distributed to two men in town, Jonas Whitfield at the hardware and a man named Beaumont who ran the feed store and whom Hale had tried and failed to buy out 2 years ago. But copies in the hands of townspeople were not the same as a federal investigation already in motion. What he had was a story that was true, delivered with enough certainty that the man hearing it couldn't be sure how much of it was already beyond his reach. What he needed was for Hale to believe the risk was too high. Hale sat on his black horse and looked at Wade, and the look went on long enough that one of the riders, a younger man on the left end of the line, shifted in his saddle, which was the sound of uncertainty. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Hale said. But the volume had changed. Not a statement across a distance anymore. Something more contained. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Wade said. "You've been taking land in this valley for 4 years by fraud and intimidation and a county official who takes your money. That worked as long as nobody had the paper to prove it. The paper exists now and it's in more than one place. And if something happens to me or to this ranch in the next 30 days, those copies go to the Federal Land Office in Helena and the Territorial Bank Commission and the Havre Courier." He looked at Hale steadily, "All of which will happen anyway in time. The only question is whether it happens before or after you make this worse." Another silence. Longer this time. Burkett was watching Hale. The riders were watching Hale. This was the particular vulnerability of a man whose authority came from the performance of certainty. The moment the performance wavered, everyone saw it. Hale said, "What do you want?" It was the first time he'd asked rather than stated, and they both knew what it meant. "I want you off my property," Wade said, "and off every property in this valley that you obtained by fraud. And I want you to understand that the men you've been pressuring, Garrity, Morrison, the Yee brothers, Mrs. Calloway, are done being pressured." "You don't speak for those people," Hale said. "I spoke with them," Wade said. "They'll speak for themselves when the time comes." Hale looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the house, at Hannah on the porch with the Winchester held loose at her side. Then he looked at the barn where Cal stood in the doorway and at Denny and Russ in the bunkhouse yard. 3 men against 11, an impossible number in a straightforward fight. But this was not a straightforward fight, and Hale was smart enough to know the difference between a fight he could win with force and a situation that had moved beyond force. You could burn a man's barn. You couldn't burn letters that had already left the county. "This isn't finished," Hale said. "No," Wade said. "It isn't. Not yet." Hale turned his horse. The riders turned with him, following the gravity of his decision the way men do when the man they're following gives them something to follow. Burkett was the last to mount, and he looked at Wade for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than his usual professional blankness. Something in it that might have been, if you were generous, a grudging acknowledgement. Then he mounted and followed the others out the gate and up the north road, and the yard was quiet. Wade stood without moving until the sound of the horses had faded completely. Then he turned around. Hannah was still on the porch. She'd lowered the Winchester fully now, holding it with both hands pointed at the ground, and she was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not fear exactly, the fear had already been managed, but the aftermath of fear, the letting go of something held very tight. Cal came out of the barn. "That was either very smart or very stupid," he said, "and I can't tell which yet." "Both, probably," Wade said. "You didn't have confirmation Garrity got through," Cal said. "It wasn't an accusation. He'd already known the shape of the gamble." "No," Wade said. "But you said it like you did." "Yes." Cal looked at the north road where the riders had gone. "He'll check," Cal said. "He'll send someone to find out if the letters are actually in Helena or if you were playing him." "I know," Wade said, "which is why Garrity needs to already be there." Cal said nothing. He went back into the barn. Wade crossed the yard to the porch, and Hannah handed him the Winchester without comment and went inside, and he stood on the porch for a while with the rifle and looked north. The waiting that followed was a different kind of waiting than what had come before. Wade had been anxious before, the low-level constant anxiety of a man watching his operation deteriorate, the specific anxiety of the night at Hale's compound. This was something else. This was the waiting of a man who has made the move and can't unmake it, and has to live in the space between what he did and what it causes. He went about the ranch work. He checked the cattle and repaired the fence sections that the February freeze had stressed, and did the evening accounts, and made himself eat 3 meals a day because he knew from experience that a man who stops eating when he's worried becomes useless faster than he expects. Hannah cooked and managed the house and said nothing about the Tuesday confrontation in the yard beyond a single observation on the evening of that day. You need to write down exactly what you said to him, the specific claims you made. If this goes to any kind of hearing, you need to remember precisely. He'd looked at her. That's a good thought, he said. I know, she said, and handed him paper. He wrote it down. Then he wrote down his account of finding the documents, as precisely as he could without incriminating himself in terms a judge could work with. He described the content of the letters and how he'd come to know of them without specifying the method of acquisition, which was a careful line to walk, and Hannah read it over and pointed to 2 sentences that needed adjusting. You write like you're trying to hide something, she said. I am hiding something, he said. Then write like you're not, she said. The hiding works better when it's not visible. He rewrote those sentences. Noah, for his part, understood that something serious had happened without being told the specifics. He was a child who picked up the atmosphere of rooms the way some people pick up weather. He stayed close and quiet and did not ask the questions he was obviously carrying, and in the evenings he sat near Wade at the kitchen table, not demanding attention, just present, and worked on the piece of wood that was now, finally, unambiguously a horse. The head was identifiable. The legs, though lumpy, had the right number. On the 4th evening after Hale's visit, Noah held it up. It's a horse now, he said. Wade looked at it. It was, by the most generous, reasonable assessment, a horse. The proportions were wrong in ways that an actual horse would have found offensive, but the intention was clear and the execution was honest. It is, he said. Noah set it on the table and looked at it with the critical satisfaction of someone who has finished a hard thing. Cal said I could paint it, he said. Cal would know about that, Wade said. He said he has paint in the barn from when he marked the fence posts. That paint is orange, Wade said. Noah considered this. I like orange, he said. Then it'll be an orange horse, Wade said. Noah nodded, settled, and picked up the horse and examined it from a new angle. Then, without looking up, Are those men coming back? Wade looked at him. Which men? The ones in the yard, Noah said. Mama told me to go upstairs, but I heard horses. I know you heard horses, Wade said. He thought about how to answer this in a way that was honest without being more than a 5-year-old needed to carry. They might come back, he said. I don't know yet. But if they do, you do what you did before. You go upstairs and you stay there until your mother or I tell you it's all right. Okay, Noah said. Then, are you scared of them? I'm careful about them, Wade said. That's different from scared. Noah thought about this distinction with the seriousness he brought to most things. Cal says you're the toughest man he knows, he said. Cal's wrong about a few things, Wade said. That's what Mama said too, Noah said, and went back to examining his horse. The word from Helena came on a Monday, 9 days after Garrity had left. It did not come from Garrity. It came in the form of 2 men who arrived at the ranch in the early afternoon. Federal men, from the Territorial Land Commission, a quiet one named Ashford and a taller one named Bridle, who did most of the talking. They had traveled from Helena with Garrity's brother-in-law and had, they said, spent 3 days reviewing the documents Garrity had delivered before making the ride south. They sat at the kitchen table, which was where most of the important things in the Mercer Ranch seemed to happen, and Bridle explained the situation in the flat, direct language of a government man who has delivered similar news many times and long ago stopped editorializing. The letters were sufficient to open a formal investigation into the land acquisitions made by the Hale Land and Cattle Company between 1879 and 1883. The investigation would examine the role of Cornelius Webb, who had in fact been disbarred in Colorado in 1877 for conduct not dissimilar to what the letters described, a fact that strengthened the case considerably. The Territorial Bank Commission had been notified and was independently reviewing the financing arrangements behind several of Hale's acquisitions, because Webb's involvement raised questions about how the purchase prices had been represented to the lenders. Hale's operation was not going to collapse overnight. These things took time. But the formal investigation meant federal scrutiny, which meant Hale's ability to operate in the county through Sheriff Pike was substantially compromised. You couldn't conduct illegal pressure campaigns with federal men watching, and Pike, whatever his relationship with Hale's money, was not going to expose himself to federal attention on Hale's behalf. What about the properties he obtained fraudulently? Wade asked. The Lundqvist land. Pratt, Foss. Bridle looked at him. That depends on the investigation's findings. If fraud is established, the acquisitions may be voided. The original sellers or their heirs would have standing to make claims. He paused. It's not a fast process. I understand that, Wade said. Do you have additional documentation beyond what Garrity delivered? Ashford said. He'd barely spoken until now, and his voice was quieter than Bridle's, more precise. Wade produced the copies he'd kept, his handwritten versions of the key letters, his account of the document's content and context, and the 2 sealed copies he retrieved from Whitfield and Beaumont in town the following morning. Ashford went through them carefully. He had the manner of a man who had spent his career distinguishing between what could be proven and what could merely be believed, and he read with that discrimination visible in the way his eyes moved across the page. These are copies, Ashford said, not originals. The originals are with your office, Wade said. The originals your contact delivered are the ones signed by Hale? Yes. Ashford nodded once. He looked at Bridle. Something passed between them in the way of men who have worked together long enough to have a shorthand. This is workable, Ashford said. It was the most federal enthusiasm Wade was likely to get, and he accepted it. 3 days after the federal men left, Hale's empire began to come apart at a speed that surprised everyone, including Wade. It started with the banks. The Territorial Bank Commission's inquiry prompted the Billings Bank, the same institution that held Wade's note, as it happened, to request documentation on 3 of Hale's largest loans, which had been secured using land values that the federal investigation now suggested had been artificially inflated in the loan applications. A bank that has been defrauded by a borrower has a different relationship with that borrower than a bank with a performing loan, and the Billings Bank moved with the particular cold efficiency of an institution protecting itself. Wade heard about it from Jonas Whitfield, who heard it from the bank's man in Dillon, who was apparently not as discreet as his employers would have wished. They're calling his notes, Whitfield said. He was a spare man who spoke in short declarative sentences and never embellished. 2 of them already. The 3rd one's pending. How much? Wade said. Whitfield named a figure that made Wade understand, for the first time fully, the actual scale of what Hale had built. It also made him understand why the man had been so determined to keep acquiring. He'd leveraged everything forward, each acquisition financing the next, and the structure only worked as long as the land values held and no one examined the foundation. Burkett's gone, Whitfield added. Gone where? Just gone, Whitfield said. Left Ridgeline 2 nights ago. Nobody's saying why. Wade thought about Burkett on the last morning in the yard, the look the man had given him before mounting, the grudging acknowledgement of something. Maybe Burkett had understood the shape of the situation before his employer had. Maybe he'd simply read the direction of the wind and decided not to be standing in it when the storm hit. Wade went home and told Cal. Cal listened and said, "Huh," which was Cal's version of genuine surprise. Then, what about Pike? Pike's been quiet, Wade said. Since the federal men came through, he's been very quiet. Quiet's about all you can hope for from a man like that, Cal said. It's enough, Wade said. For now. The week that followed had an unreal quality, the way weeks do when something large is ending and hasn't quite finished ending. Wade worked the ranch. There was always ranch work. The cattle didn't care about land fraud investigations. The fences didn't care. The water troughs didn't care. And he received reports in fragments, pieces of news that came through Whitfield and Garrity, and one letter from Ashford that was written in the careful language of a government document but contained, underneath it, the clear meaning that the case was moving. Hale himself came on a Wednesday. Not with 11 men this time. With Burkett gone and his operation under scrutiny and his bank loans called, the performance of force was no longer available to him. He came with 2 riders, and he came to the main gate and stopped there, which was a different posture than before. Wade walked out to the gate but didn't open it. Hale looked older than he had 10 days ago. It was the kind of aging that happens fast when the thing a person has been standing on shifts. Not physical decline, but something in the bearing. The certainty that had made him look bigger than his actual size, now absent and the size more apparent. "I want to talk," Hale said. "You're talking," Wade said. "Privately," Hale said. "Man to man." "There's nothing private to discuss," Wade said. "Whatever you want to say to me, you can say here." Hale's jaw tightened the same way it had in the yard 2 weeks ago, but there was less force behind it now, Sab. A habit of expression that the situation no longer supported. "You've done damage," Hale said. "You did the damage," Wade said. "I just found the record of it." "The investigation," Hale started, "is a federal matter," Wade said. "It's not something you and I can resolve at a gate." "I could make it easier on myself," Hale said. "And I could make it easier on you. In return." He looked at the ranch, the house, the barn, the layout of the place. "Your March note, the bank holds it. I have relationships at that bank." "You had relationships at that bank," Wade said. "Present tense might be generous." Something moved across Hale's face. Not anger, which would have been more comfortable, but the specific expression of a man confronting the actual shape of his situation for the first time. The anger comes when you still think you can change things. This other thing comes after. "What do you want?" Hale said. He'd asked it the same way in the yard. The first time it had sounded like a retreat. "I want what I said I wanted," Wade said. "The valley left alone. The people you've been pressuring left alone. The fraud investigated and the title sorted out. I don't want anything from you personally. I don't have a grievance against you personally." He paused. "You built something on a rotten foundation. That's between you and the men whose land you took and the federal government. None of that is my business to resolve." Hale looked at him for a long time. The two riders behind him were very still. "You're not what I expected," Hale said. "What did you expect?" Wade said. "Someone I could buy," Hale said, "or someone I could break." He said it without apparent self-consciousness, as though it were simply an observation about the categories available to him. "Most people are one or the other." "I just wanted to keep my ranch," Wade said. "That's all this ever was." Hale looked at the ranch one more time. Then he turned his horse. "The note," he said over his shoulder. "The bank will probably extend. When they've sorted my accounts, they'll be looking for performing loans to offset the losses. You're a performing borrower." Wade didn't respond. He watched Hale ride out and up the north road for the last time, two riders following, and the road empty behind them. He stood at the gate for a while. Cal came up beside him. He had a habit of appearing at moments like this without announcing himself, which was either a skill he'd developed or a quality he'd been born with. "Well," Cal said. "Well," Wade said. "You think that's it?" "The man part of it, maybe," Wade said. "The legal part will take time." "But he won't come back," Cal said. "No," Wade said. "He won't come back." Cal looked north at the empty road. 16 years, he said. "I've been riding for this place 16 years. Your father before you, and you. We've had bad winters and bad markets, and one year the creek flooded and we lost 40 head in 2 days. He was quiet for a moment. This was different. "Yes," Wade said. "I want a raise," Cal said. Wade looked at him. Cal's face was entirely serious, which was how you knew he was also, somewhere underneath it, not entirely serious. "When the March note is settled," Wade said, "we'll talk about it." "That's what I thought you'd say," Cal said, and went back to the barn. The letter from the Billings Bank arrived on a Friday, 10 days after Hale's final visit. Wade read it at the kitchen table with Hannah sitting across from him. He'd started doing that, bringing the significant mail to the kitchen table rather than the office, reading it there with her present. It had happened gradually, without discussion, the way most of the things between them happened. She read the accounts sometimes when he pushed them across to her, made observations that were usually right, occasionally made suggestions that he thought about and sometimes took. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The bank was extending his note by 6 months, to September, citing his loan's performance history and the current restructuring of their portfolio. The interest rate was unchanged. They wished him continued success in his operation. He pushed it across to Hannah. She read it. She set it down. She looked at it for a moment without expression, and then she let out a breath that was long and slow and contained, in its release, about 4 months of something she'd been holding without showing. "September," she said. "September," he said. Cattle will be in better condition by then. Spring calves. If the summer's decent, it'll be enough, she said. She said it with the certainty of someone who had been running numbers in her head for months and had finally found the number that worked. It should be, he said. She nodded. She looked at the letter again. Then she looked up at him, and for a moment her face was doing the thing it did sometimes. Slightly too still, the surface with the current underneath it. We did all right, she said. We did, he said, between the two of us. And Cal, she said. And Cal, he agreed. She almost smiled, the almost smile that she kept small, that he'd come to look for without meaning to. He's going to want that raise, she said. Already asked for it, Wade said. She did smile then, properly, and it changed her face the way it always did, opened something in it, made her look younger and also more like herself. Whatever that meant, he was still working out what that meant. He'd been looking at her face for 4 months, and he was still finding things in it. Hannah, he said. She looked at him. He had something to say. He'd been building toward it the way he'd been building toward the conversation about Noah, the way he built toward most things, slowly, from the outside in, testing the foundation before he put weight on it. He wasn't ready. He probably needed more time. He was going to say it anyway. I know this isn't what you planned, he said. Coming here. It was work, and then it got complicated, and I know I made it complicated, and it cost you. Wade, she said. Her voice was patient. I'm getting somewhere, he said. I know you are, she said. You just take a long time getting there. He looked at her. She looked back. I want you to stay, he said. Not as... He stopped. Started again. I want this to be yours. The ranch. The work. Whatever this is that we've been building here without calling it anything. He pushed the bank letter back toward the center of the table between them. I want to call it something. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the February light was fading toward late afternoon, going gold across the snow, and the horses were moving in the barn, and somewhere upstairs Noah was talking to himself the way he did when he was working on something. Hannah looked at the table. Then she looked at him. She had the expression she'd had in the barn the morning he'd told her he wanted to claim Noah. The door unlocked, but not yet pushed. You're not asking me to marry you at the kitchen table over a bank letter, she said. I might be, he said. That's... She stopped. Her mouth was doing something she was working to control. That's possibly the least romantic thing I've ever heard. I know, he said. I'm not a romantic man. No, she said. You're not. But I mean it, he said. She looked at him for a long time. The measuring look, the one that had been there from the first day at the stage stop and had never quite left, though what it was measuring had changed over the months. He sat still under it, which was the only honest thing to do. Ask me properly, she said. Not here. Not like this. When? He said. When you've thought about the right way to do it, she said. You'll know. She got up and went to the stove, and the subject was closed and not closed, and the kitchen filled with the smell of whatever she was making for supper. And Wade sat at the table with the bank letter in front of him and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the relief and the residual tension of the past several weeks, something that was almost unfamiliar to him, something that felt, if he was honest about it, like the beginning of being all right. He sat there a while longer, and the gold light shifted across the floor, and upstairs Noah's voice went quiet and then started up again, and outside Cal was talking to someone in the yard. Denny, probably, or Russ, one of the ordinary sounds of the ordinary end of a working day. Wade looked at the bank letter one more time, then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, close. He got up and went to help with supper. March came in hard and went out slow, the way March does in Montana, teasing at warmth for a week, and then pulling it back. One last freeze in the third week that killed 2 of the early calves and forced Wade and Russ to spend 2 days in the south field checking on the rest. But by the end of the month, the creek was running properly for the first time since November, and the mud in the yard was the good kind of mud, the kind that meant the ground was thawing rather than the kind that meant it was collapsing, and the light was staying past 6 in the evening in a way that changed the mood of the whole ranch without anyone having to say so. The bank payment went out on the 1st of March. Not the full note. The extension had bought time, and Wade used the time correctly. He sold timber rights on the North Ridge to the Helena logging operation, negotiated as a lease rather than a sale, which produced enough to cover 60% of what the bank needed and left the ridge intact. The remainder came from a private sale of 20 head of cattle to Tom Garrity, who was rebuilding his own herd after Hale's interference, at a price that was fair to both of them, because fair prices between neighbors were how valleys survived. The payment left him lean but not desperate. Lean was familiar. Lean was workable. He told Hannah the night it was done, after supper, in the kitchen. He'd gotten into the habit of telling her things in the kitchen at the end of the day, and she'd gotten into the habit of receiving them with the attention of someone who understood that being told things was not nothing, that a man who had spent 2 years making decisions alone in an office and then started bringing them to the kitchen table was doing something more than reporting. "It's done," he said. "Paid." She set down the cup she was drying. She looked at him across the kitchen for a moment, and the look had in it the particular quality of someone who has been bracing for a thing for so long that its resolution takes a moment to feel real. "All of it?" she said. 60 from the timber lease, rest from Garrity's cattle. Bank satisfied." She nodded. She picked the cup back up and dried the part she hadn't finished drying. "The lease terms," she said, 3 years. Renewal option at the same rate. They don't touch anything south of the second ridge line. And Garrity's happy with the cattle?" "He picked them himself," Wade said. He was happy. She put the cup in the cabinet. Then she stood with her back to the cabinet and looked at him in the way she sometimes did when she was working out what to say next. "You did it," she said. Not amazed, not sentimental, just acknowledging a fact. "We did it," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Don't do that," she said. "Do what?" "Spread the credit around to make it sound modest," she said. "You held this ranch together through a winter that would have broken most men. The timber deal, the letter to Garrity, the night at Hale's compound, that was you." "And Cal," he said, because that part was true, and he wasn't going to not say it. "And Cal," she agreed, "but you held the center of it." She paused. "Take the credit, Wade. You earned it." He was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who took credit easily. He'd been raised in a house where the work was expected and the acknowledgement was not, where a thing done well was simply the floor and not the ceiling, and he'd carried that standard forward without examining whether it was actually useful or just familiar. It was one of those habits you don't notice until someone points at the space where it lives. "All right," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to the dishes. The federal investigation moved the way federal things move. Not fast, not clean, but with a persistence that money couldn't simply redirect once it was in motion. Ashford sent a letter in late March that was again written in careful government language but contained, between the lines, the clear shape of what was happening. 3 of Hale's land acquisitions had been formally flagged for review, the Lundqvist and Pratt parcels specifically, and the bank had frozen 2 of his largest accounts pending the outcome. Cornelius Webb had been located in Cheyenne, where he was apparently practicing under a different version of his name, and had been interviewed by federal agents and had, according to a separate and less official account Wade received from Garrity's brother-in-law, cooperated with considerable enthusiasm once the alternative was explained to him. Wade read Ashford's letter and then read it again and then set it on the kitchen table. "Webb talked," he told Hannah. "Of course he did," she said. "Men like Webb always talk when the pressure comes from the right direction. He was only loyal to Hale as long as Hale was winning." "That's a bleak view," Wade said. "It's an accurate one," she said without apology. He thought about this. He thought she was probably right. He'd spent months being angry at Hale in the abstract way you're angry at someone who is trying to take something from you. But the more he'd learned about the actual machinery of what Hale had built, the way he'd used Webb as an instrument, the way he'd used Pike, the way he'd kept himself one layer back from every dirty action, the more Wade saw something almost sad in it. Not sympathetic, just sad. A man who had spent decades building something that required constant fraud to maintain, requiring him to keep Webb compliant and Pike paid and the records managed, living in the permanent low-level fear of the thing he'd built collapsing if anyone looked too closely. That was not a comfortable life. That was in its way its own kind of imprisonment. He did not share this observation with Hannah. He wasn't sure it was worth sharing. Some things you think about without it being useful to say them, and the line between a thoughtful man and a man who talks too much about his thoughts was a line worth respecting. Victor Hale left the county in April. This was not officially announced. It was reported by Whitfield, who had it from the man who had it from the woman who ran the boarding house in Dillon, where two of Hale's remaining ranch managers had stayed the night before heading west. Ridgeline itself remained, the buildings, the land, the 12,000 acres that were legitimately purchased. But it was a ranch without a functioning operation now. Its financing collapsed and its workforce scattered, and its owner gone to wherever men go when the thing they built falls down around them. Wade did not celebrate this. He'd thought he might want to when it happened. He didn't. It just was. The man was gone, the pressure was gone, and the valley could begin the slower work of sorting itself out, which would take longer than anyone wanted and resolve less completely than the Lundqvists or the Pratts deserved. That was the reality of legal processes. They moved toward justice without always arriving there, and the people who'd been wronged had to decide whether the partial arrival was better than nothing, which it was, even when it didn't feel like it. He wrote a letter to Elsa Lundqvist's daughter, who had moved to Billings after her mother died. He told her what he knew, who to contact at the federal office, what the review of her family's parcel might mean for her claim. He didn't know if anything would come of it. He sent the letter anyway, because it was the thing to do, and he'd been trying, in the past several months, to do more of those. The right moment, when it came from Noah. Wade had told Hannah he would know when the right moment was, and he'd been looking for it in the wrong places. Some private moment, some evening when the light was particularly good and the words were particularly ready. He'd been composing and discarding versions of it in his head for 3 weeks, none of them adequate, all of them sounding in his interior ear like a man performing sincerity rather than feeling it. It was a Saturday in the second week of April, a day that had finally, genuinely felt like spring. Warm enough for shirt sleeves in the afternoon, the grass starting to show green at the creek edge, the air smelling of mud and pine, and something living that winter had kept locked away. Cal had taken Noah out to the north pasture to see the new calves, which Noah had been asking about since the first one arrived, and they came back in the late afternoon with Noah talking continuously about something at a pace that suggested he'd been storing it up for the entire walk back. Wade was at the corral, checking the shoe on the roan mare when they came through the gate. Noah saw him and broke away from Cal at a trot. There were 11 calves, Noah said, arriving slightly out of breath. And one of them has a white spot on its nose, and Cal said I can name it. Did you name it? Wade said. Not yet, Noah said. I'm thinking. He stood beside Wade at the corral fence and watched the horses. Cal says the mare's going to foal in May. That's right, Wade said. Can I name the foal too? We'll see how the calf name goes first, Wade said. Noah accepted this with the equanimity of a child who has learned that partial victories are still victories. He climbed up on the lowest rail of the corral fence and balanced there with his arms out, watching the horses. He'd grown, Wade noticed. His coat sleeves were shorter than they'd been in November, his face slightly longer. Children grew whether you were watching or not, but the watching made the difference register differently, made it feel like something other than simple time passing. Wade, Noah said, still looking at the horses. Yeah. Are you going to marry Mama? Wade looked at him. The boy was balanced on the rail with complete casualness, as though the question were about the weather or the calves. He was not being strategic. He was not a strategic child. He was simply asking what he was thinking about, the way 5-year-olds do. I'd like to, Wade said. If she says yes. Have you asked her? Not properly, Wade said. Noah considered this. How do you ask properly? I'm still working that out, Wade said. Noah looked at him sideways from the rail. You could just ask her, he said. Mama doesn't like things to be complicated. Wade looked at the boy for a moment. The gray eyes, the serious face, the unconscious wisdom of someone who had been paying close attention to his mother for 5 years and knew her better than most adults would know another adult in a lifetime. You're right, Wade said. I know, Noah said, and went back to watching the horses. He found Hannah in the kitchen garden. She'd started it in March, a patch of ground along the south wall of the house that got the most sun, which she'd been working in pieces when the ground allowed, clearing the old dead growth from whatever had been attempted there before and starting something new. She was on her knees pulling dead root from the turned soil when Wade came around the corner of the house. She looked up. She had dirt on her hands and on one cheek where she'd pushed her hair back. and she was squinting slightly against the afternoon sun. "There's a fence section down on the east side," she said. "Russ was looking at it." "Russ can handle it," Wade said. She looked at him more carefully. Something in his face or his posture. She read him better now than she read most things, which was saying something given how well she read most things. "All right," she said, sitting back on her heels and waiting. He didn't do what he'd planned. He'd had versions of this in his head. Kneeling, which felt performative. Standing formally, which felt stiff. Saying something particular about what she had come to mean to him, which in his head sounded either too much or not enough. He did none of those things. He just stood in the kitchen garden with the afternoon light coming over the south wall and said what was true. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because it makes sense for the ranch or because of Noah, though both of those things are true. Because you came here and you changed what this place is. And I don't mean the cooking, and I don't mean the accounts, and I don't mean any of the practical things, though those are real. I mean that this house was quiet in a way that I'd stopped noticing, and now I notice it when you're not in it." He paused. "I'm not good at this." "No," she said, but not unkindly. "I know what I'm asking," he said. "It's a hard life. It's going to stay hard. The ranch is better than it was, but it's not going to be easy, and I'm not—" He stopped, started again, more honestly. "I'm not the easiest man to be around. I know that. I go quiet when I should talk, and I work when I should rest, and I don't always know what people need from me, even when they're standing right in front of me." "Ishki—" "Well," he looked at her. "But I'll try. And I'm better at trying when I'm trying for something real." Hannah looked at him for a long moment. The dirt was on her cheek and her hair had come partly loose, and the spring light was doing what spring light does, making everything look more possible than it might actually be. Though in this case, Wade thought the possibility was real, and not just the light. "That's the most words I've ever heard you say at one time," she said. "I know," he said. "It was a good speech," she said. "Hannah—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes?" "Yes," she said again, as though it might need to be said twice for him to hear it. "That was what you were asking, wasn't it?" "Yes," he said. "Then yes," she said. She looked at him with that particular steadiness she had, the thing that had been there from the first day, and that he understood now was not coldness and not reserve, but simply the quality of a woman who meant what she said and said what she meant and didn't perform either direction. "But I want it clear," she said. "This is my home now, too. That kitchen garden is mine. The accounts are ours. The decisions about this ranch get made between us. I'm not an ornament, and I'm not hired help, and I'm not a wife who sits in the house while the man makes all the choices." "I know that," he said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it," he said. "That's why I'm asking you." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she nodded once, the definitive nod that she used when something was settled. "Then help me with this root," she said, pointing at a stubborn piece of dead growth she'd been working at. "It's not coming up." He got down in the dirt beside her and they worked at the root together, and it came up after a minute with the kind of resistance that dead things have when they've been in the ground long enough to feel permanent. And Hannah shook the dirt off it and tossed it to the side and looked at the cleared patch of ground with the satisfaction of someone who can see what it's going to be. They were married in May, on a Saturday, on the ranch. There was no ceremony in the formal sense. The circuit judge came through Dillon on his regular schedule, and they met him there, signed the papers, and it was done in the legal sense before noon. The celebration back at the ranch was the part that mattered, and it was not grand and it was not planned to be grand. Tom Garrity came, with his wife and 2 sons. The Yee brothers rode down from the ridge and brought a cured ham that was excellent. Jonas Whitfield came with his wife and said about 6 words over the entire afternoon, which was typical and not unfriendly. Beaumont from the feed store came and proved to be a better dancer than anyone had anticipated, which was entertaining. Even old Mrs. Calloway made the trip from the flat, brought over by her nephew, and sat in the best chair someone had dragged to the yard and held court from there with the authority of a woman in her 70s who had outlasted most of the things that had tried to defeat her. Cal got into the whiskey early and by mid-afternoon was telling a story about Wade at 21 that Wade would have preferred not be told publicly, and the assembled neighbors laughed at it, and Wade sat beside Hannah and let it happen because Cal had earned the right to the story and because the laughter in the yard felt like something the ranch had been waiting for, like the window finally being opened after a long winter. Hannah wore a blue dress she'd made herself from materials she'd ordered from the catalog in February, when she'd apparently already decided how she was going to answer the question she hadn't been asked yet. When Wade said this to her, quietly, at some point in the afternoon, she gave him the look that meant she found him both exasperating and correct. "A woman plans ahead," she said. Noah wore his best shirt and a serious expression appropriate to the occasion. He had named the calf with the white nose Biscuit, which Cal had declared a fine name, and he had a theory about the foal. He thought it was going to be gray because of the mare's coloring, and he explained this theory to Garrity's older son at considerable length, while Garrity's son listened with the polite bafflement of a 10-year-old, encountering the comprehensive opinions of a 5-year-old. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, Noah found Wade standing at the edge of the yard, watching the assembled people with the feeling of a man trying to understand something that is happening to him. "Are you happy?" Noah said. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without decoration, genuinely wanting to know. Wade thought about the word. Happy was a word he'd never had a precise relationship with. It was a word that had always seemed to describe a state for other people, something he saw in photographs or heard about without having a clear map to it himself. His father had not used the word. The ranch had not encouraged it. He'd been content sometimes, satisfied sometimes, proud occasionally, angry often enough. Happy was different, but standing in the yard in May with the creek running and the new calves in the south field and Cal telling embarrassing stories, and his wife, which was going to take time to feel like a word he was allowed to use, sitting in a circle of neighboring women talking about something that made her laugh, a laugh he'd been hearing for 5 months and still found surprising every time, because it was bigger and more sudden than her everyday composure suggested, and his son beside him asking direct questions with those gray eyes. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." Noah nodded, satisfied, and went to find Garrity's son again. The summer was a working summer. There was no other kind on a ranch, and Wade did not want another kind. He'd had enough of crisis and threat to last a long time, and what he wanted was the ordinary difficulty of the work, the fences and the cattle and the water and the 100 small decisions that kept an operation alive through heat and dry, and the 1,000 things that went wrong in small ways that required immediate attention and generated no drama and accumulated, over a season, into the fact of a functioning ranch. The Territorial Land Commission issued its findings in July. 3 of Hale's acquisitions were declared fraudulently obtained: the Lundqvist parcel, the Pratt parcel, and the Foss parcel. The titles were voided. Elsa Lundqvist's daughter received a letter from the federal office in Helena informing her that her family's land claim was valid, and the parcel was available for her to reacquire at the original fraudulent price. Not nothing, but substantially better than nothing, and substantially better than most people expected from a government process. She came to the ranch in August, the daughter, a woman named Marta, maybe 35, with her mother's eyes and the particular bearing of someone who has been carrying a grief for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down. She sat at the kitchen table and Wade told her what he knew and gave her copies of the relevant correspondence, and she sat very still through most of it. And at the end said, "My mother would have wanted to see this." "I know," Wade said. "I'm sorry she didn't." Marta looked around the kitchen, at Hannah moving at the stove, at the garden visible through the south window, at Noah's carved horse sitting on the windowsill where Noah had put it, and forgotten about it in the way children forget about finished projects, moving on to the next thing. She looked at the ordinary functional warmth of the kitchen, and something in her face settled. "She used to say that the land remembers who worked it," Marta said. "Even if the papers say something different." She stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer, for the letters, for starting the whole thing." "It needed starting," Wade said. She shook his hand and left, and Hannah stood in the kitchen doorway watching the wagon go down the road and said nothing for a long time. "Do you think she'll come back?" Hannah said finally. "To work the land?" "I don't know," Wade said. "Maybe." "It would be good if she did," Hannah said. "The valley needs more people who belong to it." This was the kind of thing Hannah said sometimes, a sentence that sounded simple and was actually something more, something that had been thought through before being said. He'd learned to pay attention to those sentences. They usually contained more than their surface. He thought about belonging to a place. He'd been born on this land and grown up on it and nearly lost it and fought to keep it. And in all of that time, he'd thought of the relationship as ownership, his land, his ranch, his responsibility. But Hannah's word was different. Belonging was not the same as owning. Belonging went the other direction too, the land claiming something from you, requiring something of you, the relationship running both ways. He'd spent 30 years on this ground, and he thought maybe he was only now beginning to understand what it actually meant to be here. Victor Hale was indicted in September on 4 counts of fraud. The indictment was reported in the Havre Courier in 3 paragraphs, which was appropriate. It was a legal fact, not a story. The story had been the 4 years of pressure in the valley and the winter of fighting back, and that story was already over. What remained was the legal process, which would take another 2 years and end with Hale paying substantial fines and serving a period in the territorial prison that was shorter than what Wade considered justice, but longer than Hale's lawyers had initially argued for, which was the usual shape of these things. Sheriff Pike resigned from his office in August, citing health, which was what men in his position cited when they needed to leave before they were removed. His replacement was a man named Delacroix, who had no prior relationship with Hale or Hale's money, and who, in his first month in office, followed up on the fence-cutting complaints that Pike had ignored for 3 years and actually wrote them up, which was enough to establish that the new order was different from the old one. Wade did not track these developments with particular attention. He'd done what needed doing, and the machinery of consequence was running on its own now. And he had a ranch to run and a wife who had opinions about the accounts, and a son who had graduated from carved wooden horses to actual horsemanship. Cal having decided in July that Noah was old enough to start, and Noah having decided in the same week that he agreed. The first time he put Noah on a horse, the gentlest animal in the barn, a 15-year-old bay mare named Clover who had long ago given up her opinions about the world, Noah sat very straight in the saddle with the seriousness of someone being trusted with something important, and looked out at the valley from that new height, and said nothing for a long moment. "How does it feel?" Wade said. He was standing at Clover's head, one hand on the bridle. "Big," Noah said. "Everything looks bigger." "It does from up there," Wade said. Noah looked down at him from the saddle. "Did your father teach you?" "He did," Wade said. "Were you scared the first time?" "Yes," Wade said. Noah seemed to find this satisfying. He straightened up slightly in the saddle. "I'm not scared," he said, in the tone of someone who is perhaps slightly scared and has decided not to be. "Good," Wade said, and led Clover into the paddock. By September, the Mercer Ranch was producing at levels it hadn't seen since before Wade's father's decline. Not spectacular, not the kind of numbers that got reported in the papers, but solid and sustainable, the quiet arithmetic of a working operation that was paying its way. The banknote was current. The timber lease was producing. The spring calves had come through the summer in good condition and would go to market in the fall at weights that would make the numbers work. Hannah had expanded the kitchen garden over the summer and had begun trading surplus with Mrs. Calloway and the Garrity household, which was not yet a business but had the clear shape of one forming. She was thinking about chickens. She'd mentioned it twice, and Wade had said yes both times without conditions, which she acknowledged with the slight smile that meant she'd expected more resistance and was pleasantly surprised. One evening in late September, with the harvest coming and the first cold beginning to show at night, Wade sat on the porch steps after supper in the long, slow dusk, and Cal came and sat beside him. They did this sometimes, sat in the end-of-day quiet without particular agenda, two men who'd worked alongside each other long enough that the quiet between them had no awkwardness in it. "You got that raise?" Cal said eventually. "You got that raise," Wade said. It had been settled in June, a modest increase that Cal had received with the same expression he received most things, a slight nod, as though the universe had finally corrected a minor accounting error. Cal looked out at the valley. The last light was doing what last light does in September, going gold and then amber and then something close to red along the ridge before it gave way. The cattle were dark shapes in the south field. The creek was a sound in the distance. 16 years, Cal said. "You said that before," Wade said. "I know," Cal said. "I keep saying it because it keeps being true." He was quiet a moment. This is the best the place has been since your mother was alive. Wade thought about this. His mother had been the center of the ranch in a way his father had never understood he needed, which was the central tragedy of his father's life and one his father had recognized too late to do anything about. The ranch had declined not because of bad land or bad cattle, but because a man trying to run a place alone, Chico, truly alone, without a real partner, without someone to bring things to in the kitchen at the end of the day, made worse decisions than he would have otherwise, accumulated small errors, missed things, got inside his own head and stayed there. He had not known this exactly before Hannah. He'd sensed the shape of it without being able to name it, which was why he'd hired a cook when what he actually needed was more complicated than a cook and less definable. He'd needed what he'd gotten, which was a person who looked at his problems with her own eyes and saw things he couldn't see and said so without waiting to be asked. That was what people meant by partnership, he thought. Not two people who agreed on everything or never pushed back or made everything easier. Two people who made each other's scenes sharper. He heard the screen door behind him, the kitchen door, and Hannah's footsteps on the porch, and then she sat down on the step above him with a cup of coffee and put her hand briefly on his shoulder as she sat, a small, ordinary gesture that she did without thinking about it, and that he was still getting used to, the casual fact of being touched by someone who meant it. Cal stood up. "Going to check the south gate before dark," he said, which both of them knew he did not need to do, and which was Cal's way of giving them the porch. He went across the yard and the dusk received him. "Noah's asleep," Hannah said. "Already?" "He wore himself out on Clover," she said. "He went 3 laps of the paddock today without Cal holding the bridle." Wade looked out at the valley. 3 laps on his own. 5 months ago, the boy had been sitting at a table in a cold city room tracing pictures of warships in old magazines. Now he was riding a 15-year-old bay mare in circles, and naming calves and sleeping in a room with a shelf for his things and a nail on the wall for his coat. Children adapt faster than adults. This was either a blessing or a warning, depending on which direction they were adapting. In Noah's case, it was a blessing, and Wade was aware enough to know that he couldn't take full credit for that. The boy had adapted because Hannah had laid the groundwork over 5 years of hard circumstances, had kept him stable and curious and unbitter in conditions that could easily have produced a closed and watchful child. Whatever Noah was becoming, the foundation of it was his mother's work. "He's a good kid," Wade said. "He is," Hannah said. "He's getting stubborn, though. This week he decided he was going to name the foal regardless of your opinion about the calf name going first." "What name?" "Smoke," she said. "Because the foal is going to be gray. He's already decided." "The foal isn't born yet," Wade said. "I know," she said. "He knows. He's already decided." Wade almost smiled. The foal was probably going to be gray. "Smoke's not a bad name," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." They sat with the evening settling around them, the last amber draining from the ridge and the stars beginning to show in the east, cold and clear. The valley was quiet in the particular way it got in September, the summer energy gone and the winter not yet arrived, a pause between seasons that felt like the landscape holding its breath. He thought about what Hannah had said the day Marta Lundqvist came. The valley needs more people who belong to it. He thought about belonging. He thought about what it had taken to stay. The debt and the blizzard and the night at Hale's compound and the morning in the yard with 11 riders and the long waiting after. He thought about what had almost been lost and what had been built in the space that remained. He'd been asked once, by a man who'd ridden through looking for work the previous summer and stayed for a meal, what kept a man on a piece of land when the land was hard and the margins were thin and there were easier lives available? Wade hadn't had a clean answer then. He had one now, or something close to one. It wasn't the land itself. Land was land. You could find land in other places. It wasn't even the work, though the work mattered, though he was a man made for physical work and would have been less himself without it. It was the accumulation of specific things, a boy who called him by his name and was learning to ride and had named a calf Biscuit, a woman who planned ahead and fixed the accounts and said yes in a kitchen garden with dirt on her cheek, a man who had ridden for 16 years and wanted a raise he deserved for the last 10 of them, neighbors who had stood firm when standing firm was frightening, a valley that had pushed back against a man who thought he could own it outright. None of it was simple and none of it was finished, and some of it was permanently scarred. The Lundqvist family wouldn't get everything back. The years of Hale's pressure had cost people things that legal remedies couldn't fully restore, and the ranch itself would face other hard winters, and other bad markets, and other problems that hadn't announced themselves yet. That was the honest account. The frontier didn't become gentle because you'd survived one bad season on it. It just stayed the frontier, but you faced it differently when you weren't facing it alone. That was the thing. That was the thing his father had known too late, and that Wade had come close to not knowing at all, had been on the path to not knowing, had been the man in the cold office with the bad accounts and the burned biscuits and the systematic inability to ask for help that was going to kill the ranch. And probably him along with it, slowly, the way stubbornness usually kills a man. And then a woman he hadn't expected had come off a stage with a canvas bag and a small boy with gray eyes. And she'd looked at him on a frozen road and taken his measure and found him not wanting, but not complete. And she'd been right about both. And everything after that had been the work of becoming more complete. Not finished, not perfected, just more. He wasn't a man who usually found the shape of things in words. He felt them in the work, in the way his hands knew what to do before his head caught up, in the animal satisfaction of a problem solved and a day's work done right. But sitting on the porch in September with his wife beside him and his son asleep upstairs and Cal crossing the yard in the long dusk, he let himself hold the shape of it for a moment. This was what a life could be, if you let it. Not the life you planned, or the life that came easy, but the life that came from staying and fighting and admitting what you needed and being changed by it. The life that came from a woman who said yes in a garden and meant it without conditions and kept meaning it through the difficult days, which were most of them. The hard place. The real thing. He put his hand over Hannah's where it rested on the step. She didn't say anything. She turned her hand under his and held on, and they watched the last light go out of the valley, and the stars came down cold and clear over the ridge, and the ranch was quiet around them, and it was enough. It was, for the first time in a long time, more than enough.